I was always a decent deadlifter, decent bencher, terrible squatter. The lift just didn't make sense to my body. Like my kinesthetic sense for the squat was just complete. But, turns out if you max on the squat multiple times per day, you kind of have to figure it out. Or maybe you just break yourself, but I figured it out.
Techniques also plays a factor, because say if somebody can jump on a curb, they should be able to squat 400 pounds. If I put them in an area where all they could do is only move this way, like some suit that will not allow any movement.
So it's going to depend a lot on the individual, but it's going to depend pretty heavily on the physical attribute being trained as well. Like muscle mass, for example, just purely, you do some base building, off-season work, put some muscle on the athletes, and then how long are they going to maintain that?
So with that in mind, we're going to get on to the show. Today I got Greg Nuckols with me. Greg is the head of content for Stronger by Science, and he is also the co-owner of Mass, which is a monthly research digest. I have a lot of questions and a lot of things I want to discuss with Greg. But real quick, before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about the Mass Monthly Research Digest. How long have you guys had that out?
It's been out for a little over 5 years.
Yeah, I think I was one of the, if I wasn't one of the first, it was definitely within the first year. And it's one of, as I told you earlier, it's one of the best investments that I've ever made. I think anybody that places training is a top 4 priority in their life. If they're not getting that, they're doing themselves a disservice.
Well, I really appreciate it. And I'll also say that there, especially very early on, we were looking at orders as they came in, just like who was subscribing to Mass. And when your name came down like the customer ticker, all of us just collectively lost our minds. We were like, oh shit, Dave Tate subscribed. Yeah. That was the moment we're like, okay, we must be doing something reasonably well, assuming he doesn't cancel next month.
Well, it's what you guys do, and you do so well, is I'm so far separated from research. I mean, last time I really looked at solid research when I was studying exercise science in college. I don't even want to go back and tell you what year that was. A long time ago, right? And then you have, the NSCA journals and whatever, the National Association. What's their journal? The
JSCR, Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research.
Yeah. And I would follow those for a while, but as I'm trying to grow a business and doing all these other things, I can't just keep looking at the research over and over and over and over. And aside from that, you got to disseminate it. Like, is this valid? Is this not valid? And I would show it to people that know research way better than me and say, oh, this is crap. This is junk. This isn't. And I just got to the point where I don't want to deal with that anymore. I don't have the time to be able to vet all this out. Then what you guys do is you sort it all out. What I'm going to say, you help me out here. You summarize it, but not really summarize. Because when I think of summary, I think of, the little one paragraph that goes at the end of it. It's not a summary. It's you're collecting the data and then giving the results of the, help me.
Yeah, and trying to provide our take on it and put it in context of the rest of the research. Yes. But yeah, what you hit on is basically the reason we made it in the first place. There are 4 of us, and it takes us, it probably takes us an average of 10, 15 hours a week to keep up with the research. And, it's part of our job. Yeah. And if someone is already working 40, 50 hours a week running a gym, training people, whatever else, that's if they were doing that for themselves, it would basically be asking them to do a part-time job on top of their full-time job. So the biggest thing we're trying to do is just save people that time.
And you do, because when I go through it, just personally now, each time it comes out, I'm old school, so when it comes out, I download the PDF, then I drag it into my iBooks thing, and there it is,
nice.
Right? So as I'm going through, or I'll print it out if there's more than, because usually I'll go through, I'm like interested, not, because you guys break it down really well. Each month there's always something that I'm interested in. There's other ones like, not right now, maybe at a certain time.
Yeah.
Now if there's more, like 3 or 4 things, then I print it out, and it's like, that much. They're all sitting out there in the office there, and then I can go through and I get that really quick. It doesn't take me because I'm skim reading most of it. So it takes me no more than a half hour, just kind of skim read, go through there. And it's like, oh, I didn't think of that, or I forgot about that, or this is interesting, you know, and it's a great service that you guys are doing. So that's part of the reason why wanted to bring you out here, because I truly do believe that everybody that's listening to this thing should subscribe to it. They really should, because it's going to answer so many of their questions, and at least, or make them ask better questions.
Yeah, that's ultimately what we're going for, I think. Yeah.
Yes. With I want to get into your background a little bit, because I did a little, I mean, we got some other stuff too, like some low hanging things here. Like people want, like, what's up with the beard? Like everybody, there's like many comments of, now that it's summer, are you going to shave the beard?
I did shave my beard. It's currently shaved. What more do people want from me?
I don't know. Like, was it like longer? And now that I don't, there was like the beard and the baking thing, which like two of these things kind of like popped up. Like, okay, I got to ask about these. You know, so
sure. So
I don't even know what to ask about.
The beard, I would say, is almost like a very niche cultural thing. Nuckols men all have beards, and as I was growing up, the thought never entered my mind that I wouldn't be a bearded man. But yeah, the biggest advantage of it is it saves time. I let it grow I trim my beard about 2 or 3 times a year, so I'll let it go till it's 4 or 5 inches long. Trim it down until it's a little shorter than it currently is. Trim my mustache about once a month, trim my neck about every 2 weeks, and that's it. Otherwise, it grows fast enough that if I wanted it to be smooth, I need to shave every day or up to twice a day, which is just completely untenable. So, yeah, it's mostly to save time. Yeah.
So there you guys go.
Yeah.
I don't know where the beard questions come from. Now, what about the baking thing?
I like baking. I think it's fun. I mean, it's ultimately my hobby. I'm a very social person. We have friends over for essentially a potluck every Saturday, and I like cooking a good meal for friends. So I don't know.
Have you always been that way?
I would say I have. I've always liked doing little things with my hands, like just little crafts and whatnot. And so baking and just cooking generally is a very tactile thing. You can actually eat what you finish up with instead of just having some little like craft doohickey. So yeah, it's fun. Yeah.
How did you, now to pivot back into the training thing, like when did you first start training? Well, because you competed in 15, right? So did you find training and then end up competing? Because that's how it happened with me. I ended up competing pretty quick. Or were you training before that?
So I guess it kind of depends how you define training. So my
weight training.
So my entire mother side of my family are very large, outrageously strong people. And I just always thought that was very cool. And so like even as a little kid, like I grew up out in the woods, and I would just go out in the woods and try to figure out like what's the biggest log I can pick up. I asked my parents for a weight set for Christmas when I was 10 years old, and I ended up not using it very much because my parents were just positive that weight training was very dangerous, so they wouldn't let me work out unless one of them was down there kind of watching me and making sure I wasn't doing anything dumb. And they don't want to spend 2 hours in the basement watching me lift weights every night. So that weight set didn't get a ton of usage. So I would say that I started training somewhat consistently the summer before my freshman year of high school, working out for football.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that would be around 14, 15, right?
I think 13. Do you turn 14 your freshman year, or do you turn 15?
I don't know. I think it's whatever.
Like
so,
13, 14, thereabouts.
A couple years before you competed then.
Yeah.
How were you introduced into powerlifting?
So it was completely by chance. So I started lifting for like summer workouts for football. But my main sport growing up was basketball. I loved and still absolutely adore basketball. And I'm maybe 5'10" on a good day, and I wanted to get more verticality to my game. So at my very best, I could I could barely dunk if I got just the absolutely perfect run up. And more than anything, like, I wanted to be able to play better vertical defense, rebound better. But I really, like, more than anything, kind of vain teenage training goal, I wanted to be able to consistently dunk on fast breaks. Like that was what got me really serious about lifting. And so I go to the local gym in Little Moxville, North Carolina. Try to get coaching for that. And it just so happens that Travis Mash was coaching at the gym at the time. And so, I said, hey, I want to jump higher. Travis said, sure, I can help you with that. And then the next summer at football camp, I got a catastrophically bad concussion, like the type where the doctors were like, you can't do anything with a contact element for at least 6 months. So that knocked me out of football season, and it knocked me out of basketball season. I was pretty dejected about it. And Travis said, I think you're better at lifting weights than you were at sports, like other sport, like team sports anyways. So there's this sport called powerlifting, and we're actually going to be holding a meet at the gym in a couple months. Why don't you train for that? So that was my introduction to the sport.
All right. And then you competed from, like, I think I have it down here, 07 through 08. Is that about right? And then there was a gap. And was that college or what?
That was a random injury that I still haven't ever completely gotten over from. So it was a very random thing, and it sounds unbelievable, but I promise this is 100% true. The first time I ever pulled 600 pounds, it was in the gym. I locked it out. I felt like the king of the world. So I was just holding it there at lockout for, basically until my grip was going to give out, just to kind of drink in the moment. And some absolute jabroni is walking through the weight room, earphones on, not paying attention to anything. And he just bumps into the side of the bar. And I felt a pop in my lower back. Don't know if there was like disc damage, definitely tore my QL. And, so then I dropped the weight and unloaded it. And, I had to go to 2 or 3 PTs, and they were all like, oh, I think you have sciatica. I'm like, I don't have sciatica. I don't, I'm still a teenager at this point. Like, I probably didn't articulate myself the best.
Yeah.
I was like, I've Googled sciatica symptoms. I don't have shooting pain down my leg. Like, it's just localized to my lower back. So I couldn't convince a PT to actually rule out the sciatica diagnosis until over a year later. And so, like, I kind of think that injury just kind of marinated long enough that it never completely healed properly. But I've learned to manage it better over time, and I started competing again once I figured out how to manage it well enough that I could train somewhat consistently again.
All right, so I think that brings us to like 2012, right? And then that was that's when you hit your biggest totals or biggest lifts, right?
Yeah,
from
2012
to
2013. My biggest lifts on the platform.
Yeah, well, wait a minute. So I assume the biggest lifts, you've done the bigger lifts after that in the gym?
Yeah, so I assume you're also going to jump to my very bad meet in
No, I'm not. I was not going to go there.
We can go there. It's fine.
Yeah.
So I was kind of hoping that would be my last meet and I could go out on a high note.
Yeah.
So I was all ready to rock for a 2,000 total, and that was my ultimate goal.
Yeah.
My ultimate goal when I got into the sport is, I wanted to be like the first person to total 2,600 raw or whatever.
Yeah.
And then I realized, okay, that's not going to be in the cards. So, I wanted to total 2,000, and leading up to that meet, everything seemed to be aligning. And then I just re-aggravated my back 5 days out from the meet. And so, I still competed because I'd already registered, but yeah, so I had hit some pretty big numbers in the gym leading up to that meet, but my biggest on the platform was early 2013.
Yeah. Where I was going is you have, 2-3 solid years competing, and then gap, and then 2 to 3 solid years of competing, and gap.
Yeah.
So when's the next 2 to 3 solid years of competing? Or is that in the rear view?
Well, so I'm currently trying to lose weight.
Yeah.
Trying to get down sub 200 again after previously being entirely too big. And I do think it would be fun to try to beat my 242 numbers at 198 once I get down there. So who knows? Maybe in another couple of years, but we'll see.
So it never goes away, does it?
No, not really.
So you always think, there's that one more, or you can do this. How much weight have you pulled off?
So the biggest squats I've hit, I did 750 for a double and 765, pretty comfortable, both with knee wraps. Benched 485 and pulled 735.
Yeah, those are respectable. How much weight have you lost?
So
body weight.
I got up to 278, and I'm like mid 220s now.
And this is just on this last diet, or lifestyle change.
Yeah,
I don't like the word diet, because so that's what 50.
Yeah, it's like 53, 54 pounds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So has your life completely changed from where it was to be able to do that?
In some ways it has, in some ways it hasn't. So this is maybe not advice that anyone should take or that anyone listening to this would take. But probably the most important thing for me personally to be able to lose the weight was to kind of put powerlifting on the back burner. Because one of the things that would always get me before is I could lose, like I think such a big part of my personality was tied up in being strong and feeling strong that I could lose 10, maybe 15 pounds and everything would be going fine. And then as soon as the numbers on the bar started going down, it was, it was like there was a war within me. And it's like, do I want to keep dieting or do I want to just be strong again and get stronger? And generally the desire to maintain my strength and keep getting stronger was a stronger motivation. So I just kind of abort the diet. And after doing that about half a dozen times, I finally realized I kind of need to just not worry about powerlifting for a while so I can lose the weight and then, pick it back up. And, I think that might on a physiological basis be bad advice because, training hard when you're dieting helps you preserve lean mass, be in a better place when you're done with the diet. But I found for me, at least psychologically, like I just couldn't do that because I just couldn't bear to see the numbers keep going down.
I've always been the same way.
Yeah.
So anytime that I knew that I had to pull weight off, I would find exercises or make them up that I didn't know if I was good or bad at.
Yeah.
So then I would strain, say if it was max effort or I did a heavy single, and I would sit there and think to myself, is that good? Is that good or is that not good?
Yeah.
And then just hope nobody else came in the gym and did it for 5, to like show me that it really isn't, a good thing. So I can definitely relate with what you're saying there because there is, there's leverages that change and, fluid retention. There's other things that factor into that, but it's the question that comes there is, and I can already see the questions, coming like, well, I thought you could maintain all your strength as you lose weight. And kinda,
Yeah.
it depends upon a lot of factors and a lot of variables from there. Have you changed? Are you still training heavy?
Not particularly. Okay. So I've been doing it's similar to what you were just describing, but kind of with more just sort of like bodybuilder style training. So lighter weights to some extent, higher reps. And then essentially what I do is I'll pick a new exercise, do it for 4 or 5 weeks. Numbers go up just because I'm getting good at the lift. And then once the numbers start going down because I'm losing weight, I just pick a new lift and keep going.
That's pretty much what I do.
Yeah.
You just take those low-hanging adaptations.
Yeah.
I'm stronger. There you go from there. And when did you get into the wanting to figure out why, like the research part of this?
I would say probably in college, maybe like 2011, 2012. I got into training for the sport in like 2005. Here's actually something that someone could use to date it. As soon as I decided, okay, I'm going to do powerlifting, I subscribed to Powerlifting USA, and the first issue I got was the one where Andy Bolton had just squatted 1213. So that seared into my mind. That was my genesis in powerlifting. And so there for a few years, I just tried to consume all of the information I could get my hands on. And one of the things that was consistently frustrating was there were a lot of very big, strong, successful people saying very different things. And my knee-jerk response is like, they could all be true to some extent. But there was no, like, I didn't have a rubric to kind of grade what was more right and what was more wrong. And so one of the appeals of getting into science was like, you are like there is at least a mechanism to try to get at some sort of generalizable truth to kind of adjudicate that stuff a little better. So I think that was the first thing that got me interested in getting into science. Like just because there was so much conflicting information, and I wanted a way to be able to kind of sort through it.
Conflicting information on what spectrums? Obviously, the gym bro, the gym information, the stuff you're seeing there, but was also conflicting information on the science side as well?
Well, so I didn't know anything about the science side of stuff.
That's right. All right.
But so like one great example is, and I'm obviously on your podcast right now.
Yeah.
I mean this sincerely, not to blow smoke up your ass, but you and Elite FTS were like far and away my number one source of information early on. But then like there were other guys who at least purported to base their training methods on scientific stuff. Like a lot of your guys' stuff came from Westside, and so did the Russian stuff. But then I remember like reading interviews with Marty Gallagher, who would say like, oh yeah, the way that like Ed Cohn trained and the way we trained a lot of those guys, it was based on solid scientific principles that at least to me seemed quite different from Westside principles.
Yes.
And so, in my little like 16, 17-year-old brain, I was like, but which one is better?
I get where you're going now, because even with the stuff that we're putting out, we'd have the conjugate stuff, then there would be block stuff, then there would be the linear stuff, and then occasionally the bodybuilding stuff. And I could see if you're a teenager, you're like, like what is going on, with all this. And then, so as you got pulled into that, because my story is kind of the same when I was through college, and it was nutrition and exercise science both. And because like, okay, now what the hell, because everybody's telling me all these different things. And then a lot of things just stopped working, and I was not smart enough to realize, the longer you do something, the harder it is to be able to keep progressing. To my mind, I didn't want to accept that. It was just things that I didn't know. And then, so I wanted to find answers, that were more tangible, and just through, say, nutritional biochem, for instance. I'm like, oh, so that's what happens with, protein going all the way through your system until it comes back out. And I'm like, okay, all those guys are in the gym are dumb. They don't, So now I have like flipped all the way over, on this other side. And then it was, then on that other side, it became, well, this is whacked, because it's the application, was kind of lacking. And then obviously I just go back on the other side and try to maintain somewhere in the middle. I'm sure at some point as you were going through, because you have your master's in exercise science, I believe, right? As you're going through there, you start to see what I saw, and I don't even know how to, there's a mess everywhere, right? So I saw that mess, and I didn't look any further to see the clean, you know what I'm saying? That part, I just said, screw it. It just went the other way. What made you say, this is where I want to stay? Because keep in mind, you're still lifting at the same time. So you're living the art, right? Let's just say the art, and you got a book, The Art of Science. You have those two. So you're living the art and the science part at the same time.
So I think I fell into it almost by accident. So I was planning after graduation to just go back to North Carolina and keep coaching for Travis Mash. Like I'd previously, like over the summers, been working at his gym. And so that was my post-graduation plan. My wife and I got married in college, and she was a journalism major, and she got a really, really prestigious journalism internship after graduation, but it was in California. So, we didn't want to live apart for a few years. Kind of hard to swing the California to North Carolina commute. So we decided to go out to California. And so she was guaranteed, I believe, either 10 or 12 weeks. And I couldn't, I couldn't walk into a gym and say with a straight face, like, hey, I might be gone in 2 months, but please give me a job. So that kind of put me down the road of online coaching and content creation more so than doing a ton of coaching in person. And so, I think that it's really important to write and make information from a perspective of what things can you credibly talk about. And so I certainly had experience and have experience doing a lot of coaching and a lot of hands-on stuff. But, we're talking 3 or 4 years. We're not talking decades and decades. So what I could talk about is my own experiences, my experiences working with clients online, and, just other sources of information I had access to and could learn from and distill from. And so, it was either go into the scientific literature and try to pull out insights that people might find interesting, or just read stuff from other coaches and parrot it. But there's already a whole content industry of people parroting you, I'm sure.
Yes.
And so I didn't want to just be another one of those guys. So since I was kind of just by chance pushed towards doing the content thing, writing about scientific stuff seemed to be the only way that I could like add unique value and not just parrot stuff from other people, but also write in a way that was actually credible. And not try to make it sound like I'd been coaching people for 20 years and was an expert coach.
When did you see that there was this big gap in the industry to be able to facilitate the difference between the research and what, people like myself would read?
Can you rephrase the question? Because I think I know what you're asking, but I'm not sure.
There was a gap, and I think you guys filled it, right? And you fill it with your writing. There was a gap in the industry between, if I'm going to read this article, which is very, very heavily science cited and science based, and without being an opinion, because you can have science. We see this thousands of times. You can have a whole opinion piece with a lot of citations that actually aren't even used. I think they're just copy and pasted to put it. You see where I'm, so this is kind of going where I'm asking, right? So you would have all those articles per se that have all these citations, which I think are just copy and pasted from other articles that they've done before that aren't really in there. But then you're creating pieces that are actually having the citations in there, but then laying it out in such a way that might be slight opinion, but not. But so that was missing.
So I think the biggest gap is there weren't many people who really had a foot in both worlds.
Yes.
So I was lifting at a pretty high level. I was still coaching people at a reasonably high level, and I was also very interested in research. And I think that now there are more people who that would describe, but back then in 2012, 2013, there weren't many. And so I think that ultimately, if you're going to make scientific information useful and actionable to lifters, you need to know what lifters care about. Like you need to be able to frame a scientific discussion, with background information and context about what the kind of bro chatter about a particular topic is. So you're both going to know what's interesting, like what people will actually want to read, and you'll be able to read science with more of like a practical lens. Because you read some study protocols and you're like, okay, this is an interesting finding, but I would never prescribe anything like that to my lifter. So
yes.
To what extent is this generalizable? And so I think you need sort of that like real world lifter coach type filter to be able to make scientific information useful to coaches and lifters.
Yes. So I guess what I'm trying to say is from the information that I've seen from you even early on and and now is you remove your bias, right? Well, you may not even have a bias anymore, right?
I mean, I don't think
Yeah,
I think it's impossible to remove your bias.
Yeah, but more so than, let's say if I was to write, here's this conjugate plan, then I'm going to write it with my 100% full bias. Then I'm going to go find citations to be able to validate everything that I just put in there, which is all my bias, right? That was the majority of the content that they would say was science oriented then, right? Now the ones that just said, fuck it, I am doing that, I'm just going to write this and here's just an opinion piece. That's fine. I've never had a problem with that. That's just fine. Now when they're trying to, quote all this crap, that's what I'm saying is, back then that was the majority of the science content, was just their bias trying to go find things to support it instead of here's this, figure it out, and kind of put it out there. And with that in mind, what was there had to be a tipping point, like one topic that you were looking at that you really saw, wow, this is really cool, interesting, or this is what I want to do.
I don't know if one particular topic is coming to mind. I wrote a lot about squat biomechanics early on. That may be one thing, but I think that one thing that's important, if you want to write about science, at least somewhat objectively, is there's kind of a social pressure to confirm your biases if you're already like kind of pegged as an X guy. Like if you're a Westside guy and you have built an entire audience around writing about Westside stuff, and that's what they want from you and that's what they expect from you, and you dig into the scientific literature and decide like, oh, there's some aspect about Westside training that is not just unvalidated by the science, but is contradicted by the science, then whether consciously or not, I think on some level that if you write that article or make that video or whatever and say like, hey, like Westside overall is good, but like Louis was just completely ass backwards about this one thing, you're going to get a ton of pushback for that. And your audience is going to be alienated, at least to some extent. And so something I tried very hard to do, and I think I succeeded partially, but also failed to some extent, was to try to not let myself be tied to one single training ideology or build an audience writing about one general topic, because then I knew I would pigeonhole myself into being that guy. And then I would be like expected to just keep validating that idea forever. And so, I think that if you publicly come out too strong for any particular idea, there's just more and more pressure to keep going down that road, even if it involves cherry picking or distorting research to make it look better. And not saying that that's irreversible and you have to do that forever, but it just gets harder and harder to be objective the further you go down that road.
Oh, I'm on that road, right? So it's, very, very quickly I was caught up, in that road. And because a lot of it in the very beginning was deciphering what Louis was, or trying to decipher what Louis was doing the best that I possibly could. And then, as years go on, it's, if people speak to me more about training, it's way more block centric than it is conjugate centric. But if I even lay out what I'm talking about and the phasic structures that I'm talking about, they'll still say what I'm saying is 100% Westside conjugate, and it's kind of not, but but I don't sell content, right? So I don't give a shit, because it doesn't make any difference one way or another. Where what you're talking about really comes to the surface is when that person has programs or books or seminars or content all tied to that, then it becomes very hard for them to make their service better, because it becomes rooted and stuck in that.
So one place where I saw that very early on was my first world record total at 220. I set that after doing a block of Bulgarian, quote unquote Bulgarian style training.
Like Spazov?
No. So like, I'm so bad with names. I want to say Arabadziev, but that's a EMG researcher.
Okay.
Um, uh,
Like, well, were you working up maxing out?
Abajayev. Yeah,
Were you
yeah.
working up maxing out, then doing percentages of that max, and then on
Yeah,
that all
yeah.
same day? Okay. All
Yeah.
right.
So,
Shit.
so I'd read I'd read stuff from John Brose, who had brought Abajayev's methods over to the U.S. I talked a little bit with Max Ada, who'd gone over to Bulgaria to train with Abajayev, and I thought this seems interesting. And people were saying like there's no way this could work for powerlifting. Weightlifting, powerlifting, very different sports. There's a much greater eccentric component of powerlifting training. So if you're working up to maxes all the time, it's going to cause way more muscle damage. It's going to be harder to recover from than doing max clean and jerks and snatches every day. But I looked at what the Bulgarians were doing, and it's like, well, that's true to some extent. Like they are doing max clean and jerks and snatches, but they're also doing max squats and front squats. And they were stupidly strong squatters. So I realized pretty early on I couldn't work up to a max deadlift every day. I gave that a shot, didn't go well. But I worked up to a max squat and bench every day, sometimes multiple times per day, did some back off work. And for me, at least, it worked really well. And so I wrote about that and, I never said you should do this style of training.
Yeah.
But I said, hey, I gave this a shot. It was fun. I liked it a lot. I like maxing. So, if you want to give this style of training a shot, this is how you might want to set it up. And so pretty quickly, people started trying to peg me as like the Bulgarian method guy. And I realized that I was starting to go down that road. And I just said, nope, I'm hitting the abort button. I'm not going to talk about this anymore because I don't want to get pigeonholed like that. I want all of my options open to me.
Yeah, that's a smart move. I did something kind of similar to that when I was in college, and it was based upon what Angel Spazoff put in the NSCA journal when he came over to visit. And it was 4 weeks, so 3 times a week. But I do remember the squat session took 3.5 hours to complete. I mean, it was insane. And I almost hesitate to see this or say this, but I don't think people are going to be able to find it. So whatever, it put like 70 pounds on my squat in a month. I'm like, this is the greatest thing ever, but I can never do it again.
No, yeah, I mean, that is the program that made me a good squatter. Like I was always a decent deadlifter, decent bencher, terrible squatter. Like the lift just didn't make sense to my body. Like my kinesthetic sense for the squat was just complete shit. But, turns out if you max on the squat multiple times per day, you kind of have to figure it out. Or maybe you just break yourself, but I figured it out.
Yeah.
And so, it took my squat from like 545 to 650 in like 10 weeks.
Yeah.
And, I mean, it's the best thing I ever did for my squat.
No, let's peel that back just a little bit for people, right? So, there's several adaptations that probably occurred, during that time. You became more proficient at lifting heavier weights, right? So, there's other components. 'Cause we don't need people to go do maxing out 3 times. I can just see, it's just where this is going to lead from there. But actually, I'll pivot off of that. No, let's stay there. So with that, right? So let's just break this down into a science level. Like what attributes, or if that's the right word, what characteristics do you think that program provided for you to be able to get that progress?
I think a few things. One, it really forced me to figure out a squat technique that worked well for my body and my leverages. Like I think I have a kind of typical squat stance for a multiply lifter, but I compete raw.
Yeah, you do.
And so I had always been told like, that's not the right way to squat. But I got feedback from my body with technique if I was maxing multiple times per day, every day, where if I was squatting in a way that didn't agree with my body, it would tell me, like I would just hurt and ache everywhere. And so that kind of, I think I would have reached the same place regardless, but I think a troubleshooting process that otherwise would have taken me 6 months or a year that, quite frankly, I should have already done in my training career, ended up taking me a month and a half. So I think it just expedited that troubleshooting process. And then the other thing is, I think it got me really, really good at grinding, where, previously when I would reach the sticking point, I would typically just get there and fail, because I'd get to the sticking point in a really bad position, and I wasn't great at negotiating my way through it and like figuring out how to fight through a really heavy squat. I just, by getting a ton of practice doing those maxes, it taught me that specific skill of how to get through a really heavy squat, which again, I think that it essentially got me to a place that I would have gotten to in like 2 years, in 2 months.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking, is that when you push that all in there, because some of the things that are the hardest skills to acquire is that grinding, because you hit it and you think you're done.
Yeah.
But you don't know you can.
Yeah.
And how do you learn that?
Yeah.
Right. And then the technical part, having that all crunched in there like that, you're going to know if you don't recover.
Yeah.
And then you're going to start to kind of like figure out, well, I got to do this or this and this, or if the rep doesn't feel right. Like, well, and there's so many sets, so there's that. So I agree with what it pushes it down in there, where that's what I think it did for me as well with the heavier weights, was that, because you really, if you look at a lot of the training programs, you're really not getting under the heavier weights and the specificity of the lift that you're competing in that much over a quarter of a year.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's none, in certain quarters of the year. Now you force yourself to that. When I came out the back end, it was like, oh God, do I want to do this again? There was that whole thing to where I can see the criticism against the Bulgarian style of burning lifters out and all that other kind of stuff. I can see where that's coming from, because if you have a life, and other things that you're trying to do, just mentally though, I don't know how.
Oh yeah. So I was doing that at 20 years old.
Yeah.
I don't think I could do that today.
Yeah.
And so I was doing that over a summer when I was home from school. I was coaching at Travis's gym. I'd go in the morning, get in my first squat session, train lifters through the afternoon, or train athletes through the afternoon. Once they were gone, I would get in my second squat session, just eat dinner at the gym. And then my wife and her sister would come in to lift late at night, and I would generally do my third session then. And then I'd go home and sleep for 10 to 13 hours and repeat the process, which worked really, really well when my life allowed me to do that. Then I went back to school in the fall, and college isn't the same thing as a full-time job. Like you are going to class and studying, but there's still a fair bit of time to work out, do whatever you want. But just from having my schedule crunched a little bit more, I dropped from 3 sessions a day to 2, and my sleep dropped from probably an average of 11 hours a night to 9. But it was still a very good situation for being able to train a lot. But even just that small perturbation made it, took the Bulgarian stuff from being really productive, very tenable, to hitting a wall within a month of trying to train like that. So yeah, going from sleeping 11 to 9 hours a night, if you can't definitely sleep at least 9 hours a night, I wouldn't recommend even trying it. Because even at 20, and even after already being previously conditioned to train in that style for the previous few months, just from having my capacity to recover constrained a little bit, it suddenly became untenable. So yeah, it's definitely a high risk, moderate to high reward strategy that if all of the stars are aligned for you to be able to do it, may be worth playing around with for fun. But that doesn't, 99% of people just don't have the life circumstances to take an honest shot at it, I think.
Okay. And one thing I want to talk about is percentages, RPE, RIR. I mean, there's a lot of different names for kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
But I want to make sure we're talking about the same thing first. So I want to talk about, because this can also be sets 8, 10, and stuff like that. So let's just set that aside, and it's just singles, right? So I define intensity as percentage of a 1 rep max, not effort. And effort would be like pushing that set. One of the things that I have a hard time trying to explain to people is, a percentage for, say, a 70% for a beginner is not going to be the same as a 70% for an advanced.
Yeah.
And I think the way that some people are trying to navigate their way around that is, okay, it's not 70%. Let's just say it's a 7 RPE or a 7 RII or whatever it's going to be, and trying to. But to me, when you're dealing with just that side, not the multiple reps, they're kind of all talking the same thing, but there's still variance, right? Where the one thing I learned as a trainer early on, and it was when I was at Westside, I was training a female soccer player at the corporate place I was at, and had her max out, and it wasn't a lot. It's like 100 pounds. And then peeled it down to 80 pounds, and she did 20 reps.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting there thinking, oh, wait a minute, 80% for 20?
Yeah.
That's fucking insane. I could do like 2, maybe 5. So there's you see what there's this big gap. So what I try to help people with when to navigate all the different programs that are out there, because there's a lot of programs and they're all percent based, is that variance. Like, how does that, first off, let's, talk about why there is that variance, and then how they can go about gauging where they should, or how they should regulate the programs that are out there.
Yeah.
I don't want to call out any programs, right? But everybody knows there's a lot of programs out there that are percent based, and people are taking those that are just high school kids and applying those percents, or taking them that are, intermediate in the same thing. So what's your take on that? Like, that variance, why is that variance there? Or am I wrong and people should just do the percent?
Oh no, you're 100% right. So I think that variance exists for three predominant reasons. One is just like metabolic differences between individuals almost. So, if someone is in good shape, has maybe a super high percentage of type 1 muscle fibers, is reasonably well trained, but like if you take 2 people and everything is the same about them, but one of them has a respectable 5K time and the other person gets out of breath walking upstairs, the first person is probably going to be able to do more reps with any given percentage of their 1 rep max, just because like a single set of resistance training, like with reasonably heavy loads, is like surprisingly metabolically taxing. So just being in decent shape tends to help your strength endurance. Experience level is going to matter a lot, especially for very, very brand new lifters, largely because like if you're basing percentages off of a 1 rep max and someone just sucks at maxing, that's not like a true 1 rep max, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Like if someone's strong enough to squat, like that athlete you talked about, if she was strong enough to squat 150, but she just wasn't good at squatting, so she gets 100 but fails 110, then 80 pounds isn't really 80%. It is 80% of the max she hit that day, but it's, closer to 50, like 55, 60% of her real max, just because her 1 rep max just isn't a good number. And then another thing that's going to matter a lot is just like how strong someone is. Because one thing you tend to see is that the number of reps that someone can do with a particular load or a particular percentage tends to decrease as their strength increases. And one of the reasons for that, kind of looping back to how metabolically taxing lifting is like I think people don't fully understand. Like, I'm sure you've seen this with a lot of lifters. If someone's 10 rep max squat is 600 pounds, they're dead after that. They're going to be, it doesn't matter how good of shape they're in. they complete that 10th rep, grind it out, they're going to be laying on the ground for 5-10 minutes. If someone's 10 rep max squat is 135 pounds, no matter how hard they fight on that last rep, like they're going to be out of breath at the end of the set, but they're going to be fine. And they could get back under the bar in 2 minutes. And the big reason for that is the metabolic cost of a set, a workout, whatever, scales with the sheer amount of just physical work being done, like work in the physics sense, like how many joules of work are you completing? And so assuming range of motion is similar, that's going to scale linearly with weight on the bar. And so a set of 10 with 600 is 3 times as many calories as a set of 10 with 200. And when someone's reasonably weak, that's not going to be that big of a consideration. But when someone's pretty strong, like that's going to be a pretty big deal. So there was a study by Escamilla looking at the energy cost of deadlifting. And if memory serves in that study, people were deadlifting like 175 kilos, so like 380, something like that, for a set of either 8 or 10 reps. And the total energy cost of that was like 10 calories, give or take. And 10 calories may not sound like much, but that's equivalent to like running about 1/10 of a mile for someone who's in reasonably good shape. And so, that's like sprinting 200 meters, essentially. And so, if you're pretty fast, you can run 200 meters in like 25, 30 seconds, and you're going to be dead afterwards. And so if you're completing that set of 8 reps on the deadlift with 380 pounds, that's a similar energy cost. And so if you're doing it in a similar amount of time, it's going to affect you metabolically the same way. And if you see a 400 meter runner after a race, like they're pretty toasted. But then if you scale that up, and now instead of doing 380 pounds for a set of 8, if that's 700 pounds for a set of 8, and you're still doing it in, 20, 30 seconds, now suddenly that's the metabolic cost of sprinting over 400 meters in the same amount of time that it would take a good sprinter to sprint 200 meters. And you're just accruing so much anaerobic debt when you're doing that. It just wipes you out. And so going back to the question of like rep maxes, like that's a dynamic in play. As people get stronger and stronger, especially not if they're not in particularly great shape, you see them under a bar squatting, but the way their metabolic system is processing that, it's like they're sprinting,
Yes.
and they're sprinting really fucking fast. And doesn't take that many reps with that heavy of a weight before your metabolic system can give out before your actual muscles do. So I think that the actual physical constraint for a set to failure is probably different for really strong people and still strong but not super strong folks, and definitely different from considerably weaker people, where if you're really, really strong, you're probably going to fail, especially for things like squats and deadlifts, just because you just can't produce the energy you need anymore. Whereas for weaker folks, it's because the actual muscles give out.
Yeah.
So you're reaching a different type of failure. So yeah, that's definitely going to affect the number of reps someone can do with a given percentage.
Right. I would throw in, this may have been in the first one that you were given, techniques also plays a factor, because I jokingly would always say if somebody can jump on a curb, they should be able to squat 400 pounds. If I put them in an area where all they could do is only move this way, like some suit that will not allow any movement, that I don't know if the force equivalent's the same. It's just bullshit that I say, but they should be able to, and that's going to affect that percentage too. So going back then to that person that's looking at these programs, what is that variance if we know what that is, and how do they go about manipulating the percentages of, say, said program?
Yeah, so there's, there's like a practical answer to that question and just a how crazy can it get answer to that question. So for the how crazy can it get answer to that question, there was a study looking at like how many reps can people do at 70% of one rep max, and it compared trained lifters to people with no training experience, so their 1 rep maxes probably weren't good to begin with, who are also like pretty high level competitive runners. And the lifters, I think at 70%, averaged like 14 reps, something like that, and the runners averaged like 43. So,
No, that's crazy.
so that's kind of an extreme example.
Yeah.
But if you're dealing with people of similar training status, who are all reasonably good at the lifts being done, I think you're probably looking at realistically kind of on a practical level, like a kind of 25% range plus or minus. So if kind of the average at 70% might be a 12 rep max, some people might crap out after 9, some people might get 15. There will be outliers who get fewer than 9 and more than 15, but kind of like a 25% range plus or minus, I think will account for about 80-90% of folks.
Okay. I mean, that's a lot if you're talking 70%, though.
Yeah.
Say sets of 5 actually go to failure, to know what 9 or 10 or whatever the scale, 10 would be what to failure, right? And then have some context where the events I do out here, the train your ass off thing, is part of what I try to, from an effort standpoint, I try to take them to failure, right? To say, okay, if this was RPE for effort, right? So now we're not talking percentage. We kind of are, but we're not, because it's like a leg press and shit like that. And they go to absolute failure, then I can come back and say, look, this is an accessory exercise. Normally it's going to fall lower in the hierarchy of your training. You should probably be training at about a 6.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden they're like a 6. I was training at like a 2.
Yeah.
Because they didn't know what that high end was. When it comes to failure, I'm going to get nuanced here as well, is I can have somebody, if you tell me to do a set of barbell curls to failure, I can go to failure 5 or 6 different ways. I can just, hit an ammonia cap and just, go berserk and go insane. And I'm going to get way more repetitions with, 10 pounds per side or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Then if I start the movement without momentum and then, contract harder all the way through, hold it at the top, basically slow the tempo down, take the momentum out. So you see where in my brain it like starts to break when it's like, okay, here's, reps in reserve from failure, and I want 2 reps in reserve. And I'm like, well, what kind of reps are you talking about?
Yeah.
Because there's that disconnect there. So in research, obviously that nuance probably isn't going to be there, right?
No, typically not. But yeah, so just to bring the viewers up to speed, because I think that so one of the things we talked about when the recording was cut off is like, why are people interested in RPE and reps in reserve in the first place? And it relates back to what we were just talking about, where if you're making a percentage-based program, if you say, I want people to be doing sets of 5 at 80%, what you have in mind is like, I want people to be doing reasonably hard but non-failure sets at 80%. But if someone has really good strength endurance, those sets of 5 might be really easy. If someone has piss poor strength endurance, though, it might be training to failure from set 1, and now the program's way too hard. And so, yeah, people are interested in RPE and RIR to try to normalize the stimulus so it's similar for everyone. But you're raising a very good point, which is like, one, you need to know what those numbers are referring to. Like if someone says that set was an RPE 9, I had 1 rep in reserve, the next question is how do you know that? And one of the things that I've noticed, just kind of observing lifters online, observing lifters in the gym, is I think that there's kind of a generational gap of the pre-RPE generation and the post-RPE generation. Because, I know that when I got into lifting, I just trained to failure a lot. And like I still do. It's fun. I like working hard. So like something like bicep curls.
Yeah.
I'm never gonna do bicep curls with 3 reps in reserve. Like I'm doing it to failure or past failure. But yeah, so if you already have a lot of experience with training to failure, if someone says, hey, do a set with 2 reps in reserve, you say, okay, cool, that's easy. I know what that feels like. But if someone, if like a younger lifter who came into the sport when RP reps in reserve were already very popular, then, maybe they don't have that much experience training to failure. And if you tell them, hey, do a set of squats with 3 reps left in reserve, and then you see the video, and you just know as a coach, there were 8 reps in reserve. They need, like, they just don't know how many reps in reserve they have. And in research, we call that anchoring the scale. So if you're telling someone, hey, 0 reps in reserve, that's like one extreme end of the scale, 0 reps in reserve, 10 RPE. The way that you anchor that scale is actually get people to train to failure so that they then know what that feels like and can then work backwards and sort out what everything else feels like. And I think that with a lot of lifters, like RP and reps in reserve work theoretically, but they don't work in practice because they've never adequately anchored that scale. And like you mentioned, it's also going to depend on the way you're doing reps. And ultimately, when you're writing programs, this comes down to like, what is the purpose the coach had for writing the exercise they did and the particular training variables they did. So, if someone's doing bicep curls purely just for biceps hypertrophy and they're, taking their time, squeezing everything, controlling the eccentric, 2 reps in reserve might feel very different than someone who I guess is like training for maximal biceps power and doing reps accordingly. So yeah, ultimately I think it's down to the coach to be clear to the lifter or the person buying their program, like ultimately what is the purpose of this exercise, to like contextualize how they're supposed to feel and what they're supposed to be getting out of it.
Okay, that brings up the next question. So if we're staying on the strength field, not bodybuilding, but the lower exercises are going to be basically just there for hypertrophy, right? I mean, doing sets of 8 to 10 on, cross-body tricep extensions or something like that probably isn't going to have a whole lot of correspondence to pushing your bench up, except maybe the endurance aspect, the slight muscle endurance aspect, but it's for the triceps. So down in there, would it be better, right, for the lifter to have that slower intent to where they don't use momentum to start it, keep it more controlled, flex for a second, use lighter, this is where I'm going here, use a lighter load, right, because it's going to be somewhat maybe better on the joints. I'm hesitant to say anything concretely, right, because there's so many nuances with that, but I would say it's easier on the joints because it's a lighter load. You're going to be able to get more range of motion, take the momentum out, or to just keep it heavy, right? Let's say for yourself the difference between maybe using a 30-pound dumbbell, a 25-pound dumbbell, or using a 60-pound dumbbell, both for the sets of 6 to 8, for that hypertrophy. One, you're going to go a little slower, both you're going to be in the same RIR. Which one would be best? And granted, it can be phasic, I get that, but which one would be best for the person that's looking for the hypertrophy?
Realistically, I don't think it matters all that much. Like, I think as long as the set's pretty hard, you're getting pretty close to failure. If someone is using all of the momentum in the world for their bicep curls or whatever, like ultimately they're still going to fail because their biceps gave out. Like that is going to be the link that fails. But I do think that from a practical perspective, what you're getting at has a lot of merit. I also wouldn't make any like really strong evidentiary claims that going slower using lighter weights is definitely safer and is definitely going to reduce injury risk. But like, I kind of think it will. And I'll note, I also used to make the, I would sometimes argue and push back against that because I thought that, when you're really isolating a muscle, if you're like slightly more ballistic about it, that might put a little bit more tendon strain on you, which might be better for tendon adaptations. Like that sounds like a dangerous thing.
No,
tendon strain, that's going to hurt you. as long as the load's manageable, like you'll probably be fine. And just, just like you need particular stimuli to make your muscles adapt, you need particular stimuli to make your tendons adapt as well. So I would sometimes previously argue that like, maybe getting a little bit more crazy with it might actually be good sometimes, because that's going to give you more tendon strain, better for tendon adaptations, and make everything else you do a little bit safer. But there was actually a meta-analysis that just came out looking at the effect of different types of training on tendon adaptations. And it seems like load ultimately doesn't have much of an effect on how well tendons adapt. So, that takes away that argument in favor of maybe going heavier and being slightly more ballistic with single joint training. So yeah, now I'm fully on board with, reduce the weight, control it, take your time, and do your single joint bodybuilding style training, like accessory work in that fashion.
So if you're doing it with, more explosive intent from the beginning, like the heavier stuff we're talking about, does that have any change on the firing pattern, of the muscle, right? Of the firing, and B, if it does, is it even significant?
I mean, it probably does, but then the question is like, to what extent does that matter? Yeah. So if you really train your triceps to fire with optimal efficiency for a cross-body tricep extension, is that necessarily going to make them more efficient when they're firing for the bench press?
Yeah.
And I kind of don't think so.
No.
Yeah.
I get what you're saying. So the specificity of what's higher up in the chain, the reason for doing it in the first place.
Yeah.
So if it's just hypertrophy, forget all that, but just to grow the tricep, is that going to make any difference?
I don't think so, no.
Okay. And then staying on this, RP, RIR, all the other kind of stuff, where the reps, right? The variance in there. How am I going to try to ask this? Because we based it on the intensity, right? So is where we based it. There. Now, if it's effort, right? So now the effort, what you're talking about earlier, kind of the metabolic demands of all that. Is that, because in my brain, I kind of see that as two different scales. Are those two different scales, or is it kind of just one and the same, or is it only two different for me because I have all the experience? I know what it feels like to do the set and be on the floor after a set of 10.
Like, are you asking about like the general correspondence between like?
Well, just the effort, right? So going to the old meathead adage, right?
Yeah.
Like you're not training hard, where it's like, okay, what's that even mean? So
I do think they're getting at slightly different concepts.
Yes.
If you're training in kind of a Zen state, like you're one of those low intensity type lifters, not intensity in terms of weight on the bar, but like you're just not a super intense person in the gym. Then you could legitimately do a set, legitimately stop it when you have 2 reps in reserve, but then crank the music up to 11, hit an ammonia cap, get kind of crazy with it, and then do that exact same set, but have 4 reps in reserve if you stopped like at the exact same number of reps, like because you were in a real sense like putting more effort into the set. I do think that like RPE will certainly scale with effort, like a all else being equal, a higher RPE, lower RIR set is going to be a set that requires more effort. But if all else isn't equal and your overall approach to that set differs, you could have the same RPE, but like very different levels of effort in a set and very different levels of performance.
Is it, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, let's say on one training day, I'm doing, say 1 week I do that exercise, the next week I do the same exercise. So the first week I'm batshit crazy when I do that exercise, and it's at RPE 8. That second week I do the same thing, but not batshit crazy. It's still the RPE 8. Are the recovery demands the same?
I think they're probably not, but it's hard to say for sure.
Okay.
I do think that if you like really amp yourself up for a workout, it will probably be more challenging to recover from, even if you leave the same number of reps in reserve per set. But but I also can't pretend like I have any research to cite for
Yeah,
that.
I know. And we're just talking here
Yeah.
because the way that I would kind of go about that is to tell whoever it is, it's all still phasic, right?
Yeah.
So if you're to not do it every other week would be my suggestion, to scale it, like
Yeah.
go 3 weeks where you're going hard like that, and then 3 weeks where it's the other way, so that way you can control it, control your controllables, a little bit more, because what I think happens a lot with intermediate and above is maybe every other exercise might be that way, then the other one's that way.
Yeah.
Right. And then that impacts that next training week, say when it's not that way, it's obviously not as hard. And then they're mentally racked.
Yeah.
And that now they need to try to find a way to get even more amped up, to now we're starting to deal with recovery demands of just the mental part of being that ramped up all the time, where at what point does that become more of the concern too, now that I just said that? Because now there's a difference between the person that goes arousal curve top, right? That's obviously going to take more to recover from than slightly down on a arousal curve.
I think most people aren't idiots, and I think most people kind of figure that out for themselves. I think when people go from, just finding a program on the internet and saying, I'm going to do this, to taking that first step of, let's learn a little bit more about this. Generally, one of the very first things they'll learn is the importance of progressive overload. And I think when you're introduced to that concept, but your mind is still in a very naive state, and you interpret that as, progressive overload. That just means I have to do more every single week, and that will get me bigger and stronger, and everything's great. That tends to work quite well for 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 12 weeks or whatever. But eventually you find yourself in that state you were just describing, where, it used to be for every lift you're doing, it wasn't that hard to add 5 more pounds, add 1 more rep, but then eventually it is. And you have to cut a corner or have to get a little bit more amped up to get that extra rep or add that extra 5 pounds. And then next week, oh shit, I have to get even more amped up, or cut corners even a little bit more to add a little more weight or 1 more rep. And I think most people have the experience of going down that road and just running themselves into the ground pretty early in their training career. And even if they don't fully think through why that is, I think that experience kind of sticks with them. And just on an implicit level, they realize, okay, whatever that was, I can't do that again. Not with every exercise, not all the time. And so I think with like a phasic structure of training, that's a good way to minimize risk, so that if someone is pushing that way in a really intense block of training, they can never dig themselves that big of a hole, because that phase might only be 3, 4, 5 weeks, and then they're going to have time to recover. But I think even if someone isn't thinking about things in those terms, if they just have a decent head on their shoulders, that first experience of just running themselves into the ground, I think they take lessons from that.
No, I would agree with that. When speaking about different blocks of training, so say conditioning block, strength block, explosive strength block. So they all have, when laying out blocks, right? So there's the attribute you're trying to develop, which, say it's conditioning, that's going to be the first one. And then there's how long that attribute will be maintained after you pull that attribute out. And then let's just use the assumption of you're going to pull it completely out, and then that next block is just going to be without that, right? So conditioning phase, you're increasing work capacity, aerobic endurance, all that's going up, all that stops, and you go right into your 3 to 5 rep phase, and then onto whatever's going to be next, the plyometric, explosive, whatever. How long will that conditioning phase last before it begins to drop? I'm going to go back. You dropped it all. So there's no transition. There's no maintaining of all that. So it's just a complete drop.
I mean, that's going to vary a lot person to person. I mean, I guess my question is, why would someone do that?
Well, I know, but it's, when people lay out blocks, they're going to say, okay, here's going to be the off-season GPP phase. It's going to be this. I'm going to develop these attributes, and then I got to start getting ready for whatever competition or football, whatever the sport is. They want to maintain. They can't keep. I'm gonna it's the conjugate thing's going to come.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
can't keep building every attribute, right?
Yeah.
There's too many. You know,
Yeah.
there's not just 3, right? There's way more than that. So they have that's why, because when they're laying the blocks out, to your point, they shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
There should be something in there to kind of maintain or let it slowly, you know, because as you get ready for a meet, obviously that's going to taper down as that kind of goes up. But if they're laying that out, they're going to say, okay, how far out can I put this to maintain that component? Probably a better example would be a lot of lifters are more explosive than they are strong. You know, just so with the ones that are more explosive than they are strong, if it's dynamic work, box jumps or whatever, to be able to maintain that component.
Yeah.
What I've seen with some is I can pull that out for about 3 to 4 weeks, but then I might have to throw some plyos or a box jump in. Now I don't have to rebuild, you know, I don't have, but just to maintain it. That's about as far as I can get. Strength would be more important for, say, a football player, because it's going to be developed in there and they're going to go into the end season.
Yeah.
So each one of these attributes, about how long will they maintain that component?
It's going to depend a lot on the attribute and just the innate characteristics of a lifter. Like if in the periods of my life when I've done more cardio, if I take a week off, it's like hell getting back into it, because I'm noticeably slower and noticeably in worse shape after just like a week or 2 off. But you know, my friends who are runners, and you know that was something they were drawn to because it was something they were innately better at. They say, it's hard to start running again after a week, but my performance isn't really affected. It's just hard to get back into the flow of things. And so for them, like maybe they could take 3, 4, 5 weeks off before things really start going south. So it's going to depend a lot on the individual, but it's going to depend pretty heavily on the physical attribute being trained as well. So like something like muscle mass, for example, just purely, you know, you do some base building off season work, put some muscle on the athletes, and then how long are they going to maintain that? It seems like, at least in healthy young people, the rate of loss doesn't really start picking up until about a month after you start training. So you'll maintain most of your muscle mass for about a month out of the gym, and then after that, like, it's going to start going downhill.
So that's no training. So if there's still
very minimal. But yeah, so what I would recommend generally is, you know, even if you're not going full conjugate, for most physical adaptations you want, the amount of training you have to do to maintain the adaptation is just so much lower than the amount of training you had to do to develop it in the first place. And like, that's probably going to differ quite a bit between like high level athletes and world class athletes. Like I can imagine like someone who's competing for a gold medal, like they're a well-oiled machine, everything's perfectly tuned, and maybe like reducing their training volume for a week or 2 might affect their say motor skills to a significant extent. But for someone who's like still a pretty good athlete, but not just the top, for most things you can reduce training volume by at least half, generally more like 2/3, and maintain what you've built. So, you know, if you're going into the season and you don't want to spend as much time in the weight room, so you have just more energy for practice, you can recover better between games, recover better between practices. And during your summer workouts, your athletes were building strength, doing 15 sets of squats per week, something like that. You could probably just drop them back to doing 3 or 4 sets of squats per week, and they're probably not going to keep making strength gains, at least most of them, but they should be able to maintain the strength you've built throughout the entire season with that. Similar with conditioning, like most of the time, if you're training team sport athletes, the practices themselves are going to be challenging enough that if you do some dedicated conditioning in the off season, just from practicing their sport, they should be able to maintain things pretty well. So yeah, what I would advocate for is try to figure out how little you can get away with doing something while still maintaining things, and just not worry about losing those adaptations in the first place.
Well, the conditioning, it's let's go to the powerlifter, right? So if you look at most programs, albeit whatever style it is,
Yeah.
you're usually looking at, very, very low week, the week before a competition.
Yeah.
Then the day of the competition, 9 lifts, right? Maybe in warm-ups and 9 lifts. And then the week after, a little low too. So you're kind of dealing with close to a month of very, very low conditioning, aerobic workload, all that falls. So that definitely, and leading up to it, it was out.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I know the answer to this, but I'm going to throw it out there just so people can hear it. It would be important to bring that back, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So as they come out of that, right? And so after the meet, that emphasis should be on trying to increase their work capacity, their aerobic capacity, because that's what allows them to be able to recover.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah.
Can you go into that a little bit more? Because I don't think a lot of people really get that. Like, why is that important to their ability to recover later down the line when they're doing the 3s and the 5s and the heavier stuff?
So it's going to affect a couple of things. One, just if you're in better shape, everything you do is a little bit less metabolically stressful, and so it's going to be a little bit easier to recover from. But then also, like, just doing some amount of cardio affects your parasympathetic nervous system. Like, it keeps you, it helps you come down after a training session a little better, and just helps your body shift into the rest and recovery state a little bit more effectively. And just generally, the better shape you're in, the more efficiently that process works. So those are the two biggest things I would say. And it just helps. It helps your training sessions be shorter. Like if you can, with your hardest training, if you can go like 5 minutes between sets instead of 15 minutes between sets, if you're just in really piss poor shape, helps the rest of your life go better because you don't have to spend 5 hours in the gym every day.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. I'm going to flip the topic here and talk about hypertrophy a little bit, because there's two schools of thought, right? You have the higher volume, then you're going to have the lower volume, higher intensity, right? So it's basically HIIT training and whatever the higher volume is.
Yeah.
Again, I think this should be phasic. People should use both, but what's the difference between the two? And then what's the research say in regards to both?
Sure. So I think that this actually lends itself to a meta discussion of how science itself works.
Yeah.
And hopefully this will be fine for this podcast.
Yeah.
But so I think ultimately, I think both schools are right.
Yes.
And I think that we don't have the right type of research to really answer the question perfectly. So ultimately, the way most scientific research tends to work is if it's a longitudinal training study, you're going to have one group of people do one thing, you're going to have another group of people do another thing, and then what you're comparing at the end and what you're actually analyzing is average responses. And so you might find that, like, program A on average works better than program B, and it's a big enough difference and low enough variance that it's a statistically significant outcome. And then, you run to the presses and say, ooh, program A, it's better. We're going to do that. That's good. That's scientifically validated. But one of the things that, I'm sure you've observed coaching athletes, certainly something I've observed, is that, like, different training stimuli work better or worse for different people. And so ultimately, like the people who are really in the high volume camp, a lot of them have previously done lower volume, higher intensity, closer to failure stuff. They shift over to high volume and they say, dude, I'm growing so much better now. I'm recovering better. This is great. Those other people, they're idiots. They don't know what they're doing. But then a lot of people in the lower volume, higher intensity, closer to failure camp were previously doing the high volume stuff. They move over and they're like, dude, I'm growing so much more. I'm recovering better. I used to be doing so much junk volume. Those people are idiots. This is right. Yeah. And ultimately, I think one of two things could be going on, probably both. One, I think that novelty itself is an important variable. And if you were doing, like, really high volume stuff for 2 years straight, maybe you've just fully adapted to that stimulus. And just by shifting over to a very different stimulus, regardless of whether it's inherently more effective, it is now at this point in time more effective for you because that other thing you were doing just wasn't working anymore because you'd fully adapted to it, and vice versa, going the other direction. So I think that's one thing. And then the other thing is like the research paradigm that you would use to look into that ideally should either be within subject unilateral designs or crossover studies, where and I think within subject unilateral designs are best for this, where maybe you're doing quad training and you have one leg do high volume training but a little bit further from failure. You have one leg do higher intensity, lower volume, closer to failure training, and just compare which leg grew the most. And oftentimes when you actually conduct those studies, you'll see that, if you just analyzed group averages, you would say one thing was better than the other. But on the individual level, what you might see is that for half of the people, both were similarly effective. And then for 30% of people, program A was more effective. And for 20% of people, program B was more effective. And ultimately, as coaches, that's what we're interested in. Like, we want to find the most effective thing for any given individual. So we need more studies like that. And then we also need more studies trying to look at predictors of which one is more effective for a given individual. So I could see it being very plausible that maybe if someone is not particularly explosive, like they're a type 1 dominant athlete, more inherently fatigue resistant, to be able to generate enough fatigue to give their muscles a good stimulus, they just need a higher training volume. Like, I'm not saying that that's true, but I would not be surprised at all if that is true. And then conversely, if someone's like an explosive type 2 dominant athlete, if they do the really high training volume, that might just put them underground. But if they just do 2 or 3 really intense sets, that's very productive training, and they don't need as much volume to be a strong enough stimulus for adaptation. So, it would be great if there was studies where, you use a within subject unilateral design or a crossover design, and you're also just taking a ton of baseline measurements of the lifters. And then you're looking both at individual responses and then also what are the predictors of those individual responses. I kind of think that's the next frontier of sports science research. And there are some studies that take that approach, but very, very few. And ultimately, when it comes down to individualizing training, like that's the sort of data we need.
Let's go into accommodating resistance. So just bands and chains, and there's other things on the actually developed now that are cable machines and applications for all that, but I don't know the names of all those, so I can't sit here and speak about them. So we're just going to talk about the bands and the chains. And there's obviously 2 ends here. There's the hypertrophy, then there's the strength. Right. So on the strength end, what's the research that's coming out now? Or not now, but the most current.
Yeah. So it's like overall, the research tends to suggest that training with bands and chains is about as effective as training with straight weight, but not more so, not less so. There is some amount of nuance to that, because like a key question you might ask is stronger where? Because ultimately you're generally testing like 1 rep max strength, and that's your strength measure, right? And ultimately, a test of 1 rep max strength is how strong are you at the weakest point in the lift? And for most lifts, that's relatively low in the lift. And so with bands and chains, the resistance you're working against increases as the weight moves, as you progress through the concentric. And so I think it makes at least some intuitive sense that they don't help that much, at least with like raw 1 rep max squat, bench, deadlift. But I do wish that those studies would do more isometric joint testing, or just like partial strength testing, where like with like a bench with really heavy chains or really heavy bands, I would not be surprised at all if you were comparing, accommodating resistance on the bench to just straight weight, if they were similarly effective for 1 rep max full range of motion bench press strength, but training with the accommodating resistance helped way more with a range of motion similar to like a 2 or 3 board press, because ultimately like you are further overloading that part of the range of motion. And so I do think that accommodating resistance probably does help you build more total strength in a generalizable sense through the entire range of motion. But ultimately, like, you are still just limited by strength through the sticking point. So that advantage may not show up in 1 rep max tests.
Okay. Where I would go with that is, and I don't know if this is looked at or not, is the ability to start the lift properly. You know this from the squat. I mean, if you're not set at the exact position you should be in, it's a little off, the whole lift goes to hell. Right. So that top is kind of vital, right? So, and to overload that, kind of like the Bulgarian, so, you know, to hit that more frequently has an impact on your ability to start better, which is going to keep you in that position better, to where you can overload. So now you can get that overload here, right, without the taxing environment at the bottom, to be able to help ingrain just, you see what I'm saying, just that start part, to be able to get bands and chains are a little bit different. Bands are going to try to throw you around, so you got to get tighter, right? You know, at the top, which is going to
I mean, I kind of think unless someone's just sure that they really want to sell out on band training and really do it, I think that kind of what you're getting at is, if you want bands to be effective, you kind of have to do a lot of band training all the time just to get a feel for the bands.
I don't know about that. Let's say if it's a beginner that I'm working with, and I just can't teach them to get tight before they squat.
Oh, okay.
You know, so I can put a band on there, and immediately they have that awareness.
I see what you're getting at.
I need to get tight, right? And then as that scales up to a stronger lifter, so as a teaching tool, right? So I would say that's more limited on the number of weeks. It's just 1 or 2 to be able to reacclimate that.
I've never used bands like that, but I can certainly see that.
And then the other way would be, say, at the bottom you have a high school lifter that just doesn't know how to stand up with intent. And you have them do a box squat and put a band on there, they're going to try to stand up slow like they normally do. They're going to go right back down. They're going to realize, oh shit. Then they're going to stand up faster. You know, so that's the teaching. I don't know if we're talking strength here. You know, we're probably more skill acclimation, or at least skill. I can't think of the word I'm trying to think of. Acquiring skill acquirement. You know, with that. But that's not. I mean, I was part of that school that went through, you know, 8,000 pounds of band and not much at the bottom, and that's, sorry, fucking worthless. It just beats the shit out of you, because there's too little at the bottom. Even though there's still tension there at the bottom, it's just not the same as with that. So, you know.
So Dave, you'll enjoy this. My first training crew when I got into powerlifting, like I said, Travis got me into it. Once I had that concussion, I was like, okay, I'm doing powerlifting now. So he said, okay, cool. You can come train with our crew. And it was almost exclusively multiply lifters. They were all very strong, much older than me, much bigger than me. I'm still like a 14, 15-year-old kid. So it was like Travis, Joey Smith when he was doing full power, few other guys, most of them very strong, way stronger than me. And so on like a dynamic or even max effort squat day, if they're squatting with band tension, they might have 600-700 pounds of band tension on the bar. And at the time, my 1 rep max squat's like 365. And so, you know, they're doing 600 pounds of band tension plus 400 or 500 pounds. And I'm just doing the bands exclusively. And like maybe get a 25 on, maybe get a 45 on, but basically just the bands. And I'd unrack it and I would feel like my spine was compressing because, you know, it was 400 pounds more pressure than anything I'd ever done before. But yeah, I don't think that did anything for me.
No, I did not. No. I mean, it's like I said, I think there's a sweet spot, you know, with it, where if it's too much, right? At the same time, there's also what I've seen with the bands is, if the lifter learns how to use it, it kind of acts like it becomes 2 more legs. So now you become more stable. Then when you take them off, there's no stability because you lost that. So there's that there as well, where I really think from the experience that I've had, it boils down more to getting the intent to be able to come out with that force. But then once that's there,
Yeah.
kind of move on and you go. Now, there's a ton of people that disagree, obviously,
Yeah.
with me, because it has to always be that because of, the stretch reflex, which is not.
Yeah, that's not going to help your squat as much as people think it
Well,
will.
let's go ahead, go into that a little bit. So let's say you got all this band tension, right? Then when you say it's a box squat, you sit down there, all that band kind of transfers in there,
Yeah.
right? Miraculously, this is supposed to like go down to the floor and then come back from the floor back to your butt and then help you stand back up faster, right?
Yeah.
That's in theory, that's what's supposed to happen. What's really going on?
I mean, like that is true to some extent. Actually, in the case of the squat, I don't know how true we know that to be. So for like jump research, for instance, if the eccentric phase of a jump is faster, you tend to get a more powerful stretch shortening cycle reaction from that. I don't know if you're descending fast enough on the squat for that to even matter. And it appears like going past descent speed, like the thing that's going to accomplish most of the stretch shortening cycle is just, was there an eccentric phase preceding the concentric you're about to do? And that will always be the case. There will always be an eccentric. So I think basically your bases are covered there. And also, like, generally the sticking point you hit in the squat is far enough away, both in terms of distance and time, from the very bottom of a squat, especially if you're grinding it, that generally any stretch reflex would have already dissipated by the time you get there. So, yeah, I don't think it's making that much of a difference.
Okay, if we're talking the time, right? Because when I think of, say, classic max effort training, changing the exercise frequently, I don't look at, yes, I mean, there's the exercises that are going to have the greatest or the best specificity to carry over. Then there's going to be ones that really don't, right? It's just straining. But so let's say the lifter has the ability to be under tension or to strain in a squat for 10 seconds.
Yeah.
Right. And let me define what I mean by under tension as well. A lot of people think that begins when you start to squat down. I don't believe that to be true. I think it begins as soon as you grab the bar and you start wedging under it because your body is under tension, right?
Yeah.
And so that's when, if you had a timer, you would start the clock until you go to rack it. So let's say this athlete can strain for 8 seconds, right? Where if all the max effort work that you were doing only goes to 6, 7 seconds, then they get into a meet and they get to that, assuming they get through what you're talking about, they get out of the bottom, right? The bench would probably be a better example for this than the squat. And then are they missing that, assuming that they're keeping their technique, are they missing that lift because of the ability to not be able to strain for that time that they've been conditioned to? Or, and granted, there's probably multiple things, but is that a component?
I guess it could be on the deadlift for people who might grind a deadlift for 20 seconds, but almost always I don't think so.
Okay.
But I actually did want to circle back to one thing you were talking about, using bands as a teaching tool for the squat and getting tight. One place where I think that like Louis and Westside have been criticized for, I think unfairly, when looking at the motor learning research, is the amount of variation that you might do for main lifts. So people were really on a big specificity kick there for about 3, 4, 5 years. And they would say, like, man, if you're doing so many different versions for your max effort work, like, you're never getting particularly good at one of them. That's not going to carry over as well as just doing competition squats all the time, every workout. And I think that on one hand, it's a case where all roads can lead to Rome. Like, you're still practicing the lift.
Yeah.
But also, when you look at the motor learning research, it turns out generally the best way to get really good at something isn't just to do that one thing all the time. It's generally to do close variations of that, or close to moderate
Yeah.
variations of that one thing pretty frequently. So, like, if you want to get really good at shooting free throws, instead of just shooting 100 free throws a day, shoot 100 shots a day, but from all different places on the court. Like, that will improve the general skill of shooting, which then carries over to the specific skill of shooting free throws. And so I think that one value of conjugate and rotating exercises is you never like fully master any one of them. And like one of the processes going on there in motor learning is implicit error detection and correction. So if you get good enough at something that you're not really making noticeable errors anymore, you don't either consciously or just like implicitly, like your subconscious kinesthetic awareness never has to like reason through what went well, what went poorly, and like what do I need to improve to get better at this movement. And so I think by rotating exercises, at least to some extent with some regularity, that does help build up the generalized skill of squatting, benching, deadlifting. And I think ultimately you can get very good at squatting, benching, and deadlifting with both approaches, both the high variation and low variation approaches. But I think a lot of people have argued that, like, yeah, you want minimal variation because if you have even like a moderate amount, that's going to screw up your motor learning and you're not going to get as good at these exercises. And that's fully contradicted by the motor learning research.
Yeah. That's, I kind of would know that, or just from being in there. Now there's movements you get too far. You get too far away,
Yeah.
you know, and there's a lot of things. And we would just know based upon, we would see the correspondence. Like every time, because there's max effort stuff or max threes or what. Every time this goes up, that went up. And then there were other ones like, oh shit, you know, this goes up. Get rid of this. There's no correspondence. And over a period of 20 years, you kind of figure out what's in there and what's not in there and kind of how it plays. But going back to what you're talking about with just the background of the conjugate, right? When we get in the weeds here of the short, what are the shortcomings of the Soviet translated texts that go way back?
I mean, I can tell you just from a scientific perspective what the shortcoming is. What they were doing is what we would call like retrospective research, where essentially what they do is they would find like successful coaches, successful athletes, and then just kind of ask them, hey, how did your last training cycle look leading up to the Olympics? Or, you know, if coaches were keeping really detailed plans, like Soviet sports science researchers would just ask, like, hey, can you turn over the training logs for your lifters from the last 4 years of training, like for this entire Olympiad cycle? And most of that research was just kind of like collating what worked for our athletes, which is valuable when you have retrospective research like that with high level athletes, what you can say with perfect certainty is that whatever they were doing was good enough for them to win. And so it couldn't be too detrimental to keep them from having success to reach the podium. But that also doesn't necessarily mean that it was the best it could have been. You know what I mean? Because it's not experimental research. You're not testing a counterfactual. You're not comparing two different things. You're just finding methods that maybe aren't optimal, but we know at least work well enough. And so I think we can't necessarily conclude that those were the best methods because, and we can't chalk all of Soviet Olympic success up to training because, you know, they had a really, really robust talent identification and development system where, like, the way it works in the US is, you know, people play sports as kids and they find something that they like and hopefully they're good at it. And if they're good enough at it, they go to the Olympics, win gold, go pro in a sport, whatever. The way it tended to work in the Soviet Union is they would have developmental academies where they were actually screening people from an early age to figure out what their like physiological aptitudes were. and then specifically sorting them into sports that were well suited for those things. Like I think some other countries that are doing that pretty well today, not in the exact same way the Soviets were, but just like early talent identification and development is, I think Norway does that pretty well. That's one of the reasons they do so well in the Winter Olympics. And the Netherlands does it pretty well, which is why like they win a pretty decent chunk of medals for the size of population they have. So like those were two of the really big things going into Soviet Olympic success. It wasn't all just that they had way better training methods than everyone else. They did a better job matching the athletes they had to the sports they would excel at. And like, I hope this isn't too controversial. Like they were doing good with the drugs, you know, like everyone in that era was doing drugs, but I think it's generally understood that they were doing it the best.
Yes.
So, you know, to take all of that in context, but then just look at the sports science and say, yes, but they succeeded because of the sports science and their training methods were the best. I don't think you can draw that conclusion.
Okay. I'm glad you said Norway and what was the other country that you said?
The Netherlands.
Netherlands.
Yeah.
Because they're smaller, right? Because the counter to that would be, you know, here in the States, we kind of have the same thing, but we have such a large population that that's why, you know, but our athletes generally don't go into those sports.
Yeah.
You know, our best athletes are going to go into baseball, football, you know, higher paying.
Oh, yeah. There are millions of people playing D1 football that are never going to make the NFL.
Yes.
That could probably win like a bronze medal in some random sport.
Yes.
But, you know, they spent their entire youth playing football instead of any number of other things.
With strength training in general, there's some absolutes like progressive overload and stuff like that. So for those listening, what are absolutes that, you know, are 100% science-based need to happen for you to be able to get stronger? I mean, the low-hanging fruit, I mean, it's all the lowest hanging stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, really the only two things I would say is some degree of progressive overload and some degree of specificity for, you know, whatever movements or exercises you want to get stronger on. Other than that, you're getting into the realm where it's just matters of degree. Like something may be more effective than something else, but nothing is like purely indispensable.
But without a phasic structure to the plan, the progressive overload's not going to work because it's just going to fail.
Well, yeah. So I think that this is inherently an iffy list because you know the question is for who to get stronger.
I gotcha.
If it's like, you know, how's Dave Hoff going to total 3,200? You know, then everything matters. Nutrition's going to matter. Supplementation's going to matter. Recovery's going to matter. But if it's just like you take someone who's never trained before and they want to get kind of strong, like, yeah, I think progressive overload and specificity is about all you need.
Okay. I'm glad you said that because that's going to help to disseminate this conversation moving forward here is because this is what I think is happening now, right? Is to, as you said with Dave, everything matters, right? That top lifter that's been doing it forever, everything matters. And that's hopefully going to give him 5 more pounds, 10 more pounds per lift per year, right? It's when I did his podcast, one of the questions kind of made me laugh a little bit. It was like, you know, why did it take 8 years to put 135 pounds on your squat when it only took, you know, it's like, come on, you know, he's been doing this. But at that level, every little tiny thing, you know, matters, sometimes to bigger degrees than people would think, but only because that one thing was neglected for so long. Where with the beginner, they're looking at all those things, right? Or even the intermediate, they're looking at all those things and they're being too heavily influenced, you know, on all those things instead of just focusing on that basic, you know, progression from week to week to week. So, and the science that comes out is this is kind of one of the questions that was in there. Is it, how do I word this? Is it confusing them more, right? Because there's science, everything's science-based. I mean, and now it's all science-based. Even the people that aren't science-based are science-based.
It's a branding exercise.
It is.
For a lot of people.
Unfortunately, it has become that.
Yeah.
Where you'll get these intermediate beginner lifters and they're so confused because like, oh, I got to do this, and it's all these different things. In one aspect, it's become overwhelming, for them. That's why I asked, what are the basic things that are in there? So if we were to go a little bit more nuanced than just those two things for that population, what should they focus more on than all, the other noise?
I mean, these are, I guess, tougher to quantify, but effort and consistency, like if you're getting your sessions in and putting a reasonable amount of effort in, that's that's going to get you 80% of the way there. It's not going to make you a great lifter, but it's going to at least make you a good lifter.
Yeah.
And then beyond that, like getting in bed enough, eating enough protein, not like severely under eating. And I think beyond that, like one thing I think is very important for kind of taking that next step is just learning how to troubleshoot things for yourself. Like I think where people really confuse themselves with either making quote unquote scientific content or certainly consuming it is I think people have the same drive they always did, which is they're trying to figure out the single best optimal way to train. And they think the way to do that, the way they thought used to be the way to do that was, oh, well, let's just find the strongest guy or the biggest guy and copy their workout and do that. I think the current drive is like, ooh, well, let's look at all of these different variables and look at the research and see what that tells me. Like, what's the optimal training volume? What's the optimal frequency? What's the optimal intensity? Whatever. And I think like that feels better because now you're cloaking it in science. But ultimately, that's the exact same process as just being like, I want to get big. How's Ronnie training? Like it's still the same process of trying to find the single kind of secret, perfect way to train that's going to take them where they want to go. But I think that ultimately what people hopefully figure out is that simply doesn't exist. And once you get the basics down, then it's just a matter of troubleshooting to figure out what works best for you. And I really think more than anything, that's the next step. And I think what science can inform you about is, one, it can help put more tools in your tool case. So you could read a study that says program A is better than program B, and look at that and say, ooh, well, I got to do program A because it's better. Or you can look at the results and say, hey, lifters got stronger doing both of these programs. They're both effective. Let's tuck that away. Like, instead of it being exclusionary, it's more inclusionary. Like, you're just learning more and more about what can work. And then it can help you prioritize tools in your tool belt, tool case. Like, if you're seeing pretty consistently that two things work, but one thing tends to work better than something else, then if you hit a roadblock, you plateau, and you're choosing, hey, which one of these roads I want to go down, you go down the one that has the more support in the research. And maybe that's not going to be the best road for you. Maybe it will be the other road. But, more often than not, you're more the norm than the exception. And science is ultimately telling you the norms, what tends to work pretty well for most people. And so that helps guide that troubleshooting process. But ultimately, it's not going to tell you exactly where you need to go.
Yes, we were talking earlier, it's the auto-regulation, which I'll come back to that in a minute, because I think you did a good job of defining effort earlier. Now you just mentioned consistency. Let's talk about that a little bit, right? Because that is one with, that's in the top 4. Like, what should people do to be able to progress, progressive overload, consistency, and all this other stuff. Where consistency, there's I like to hear things, then I like to try to find reasons why it's wrong, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's just kind of how my brain works. And then I think back with consistency of, we all know those people that you'd always see in the gym over and over. They're always there. They never missed, and they never got stronger. They never went anywhere, but they were the most consistent ever, right? So effort, you know, definitely plays into that. But I can't sit and say that consistency in the way most people think of it is that high up, right? Because I know people that have made progress on one training session a week, you know, maybe 2 one week, 1 the next week, but basically very inconsistent, right? But still make the progress on there, where I know that's not what you're saying by the consistent. You mean just consistent enough to be able to get the adaptations that somebody's looking for.
Yeah.
But that's very broad, you know, on how that could be applied, where I wonder sometimes how many people won't train for a 2-month period of time or 3 months because I'm only going to be able to make it in, you know, once every 5 days or once every 7 days. So then because the consistency is not there.
Yeah.
So where with that's weird, because you got strength, you got hypertrophy. They're like 2 different conversations, right? Where, you know, well, maybe it's not. Well, can strength be maintained longer than hypertrophy? Let's say if it's hypertrophy that you're trying to develop, not strength, does that frequency, that's what I'm looking at, does that frequency need to be more than it would be with the strength?
I think strength probably drops off quicker than hypertrophy does, because I do think it's not completely unrelated things. Like in broad strokes, I kind of conceptualize strength as hypertrophy plus skill. And so you've got 2 components with strength, and if you start losing muscle, you're going to get weaker, and if your skills degrade, you're also going to get weaker, even if you maintain all of the muscle. And so, you know, just since you have 2 components you're working with, and I do think skill degradation takes place a little bit sooner than you start losing a fair bit of muscle, I do think you'll lose strength a little bit quicker, even though it will come back pretty quickly once you get back under the bar. But no, I don't think those are 2 completely different conversations to have. I think that I think ultimately a lot of it is going to like the extent to which consistency is important. I think a lot of that is going to come down to, are you at the phase in your career where it's really hard to keep improving your skill with the lifts? And are you at the point in your career where to keep getting stronger, like you definitely just need to put more muscle on your frame? Like I think people who can get away with being pretty inconsistent with their training and keep making gains are the folks who already, for the most part, aren't particularly skilled lifters. And so, you know, if you work out once this week, you work out once next week, there's still plenty of room to improve. So your skills probably did improve a little bit. Weight on the bar is going to tend to go up. And like if you haven't already tapped out all of the strength you can get from your current level of muscle mass, then you are, you know, it's not going to matter quite as much like if you're getting to the gym often enough and training hard enough to build muscle, because lack of muscle mass isn't limiting your strength progress. So I do think it becomes, I think like the operational definition of like how much consistency matters does increase as training status increases. I mean, just like most things, like if you're relatively untrained and not that good at lifting yet, consistency could just mean making sure you get to the gym at least once every week and not just completely leaving training by the wayside. And if you're a really good lifter, you know, being adequately consistent might mean pretty much every week trying to get to the gym at least 4 or 5 days a week. And then when life isn't cooperating with you, still getting to the gym as often as you can. Like if it's going to be a dicey 2 months due to work stuff, family stuff, new kid, whatever. So yeah, like ultimately both of them got to get in and put in the work, but how much is actually like mandatory and required for progress is going to increase as training status increases.
Right. This when So anabolics, right? So we're going to throw that out. Yes, it's going to take the natural lifter to another level. That's obvious. Everybody knows that, right? The knock on some programs would be it's you can't do that unless you're taking shit, right?
Yeah.
Or the flip side is this is a raw program. Like this is made for a raw lifter. This is made for a lifter that's not raw. I see that as you can have, if the skill is there, and the raw lifter has also got to, I hate the word genetic ceiling, but say they're genetic ceiling. The raw lifters got to that point, and then the anabolic lifters also got to that point with the anabolics. It's still, are the recovery demands still not the same between one and the other at that same point?
I'm not the person to ask about that.
Okay.
I mean, I've trained with people
Yeah.
on gear. I've heard anecdotes from them. I personally have no experience.
Yeah.
And
I was just more with the research, because the research is not good.
The research isn't there.
Okay.
Which makes sense, because I mean ultimately, like you're talking about illegal controlled substances, at least in the U.S.
Yeah.
And so like for a very similar like type of research, like there's also not much research on like the effects of cocaine on aerobic performance.
Yes.
That's because cocaine's illegal. And if you write to your university IRB and you say, hey, I want to get 20 cokeheads into the lab, have them snort a line on school property, and then hop on the treadmill, the IRB is going to say no. Like that, we're not doing that.
Yeah.
And whether this is right or wrong, the same logic applies to steroids.
Yeah.
So they're hard to do like randomized control trials on, and certainly looking at changes over time. Like if you go to your school's IRB, their ethics board, and say, hey, we want to find 30 people who've never used steroids before, and then get them to use steroids at the start of this study, they're going to look at you like you have a third eye. Like, what are you talking about? So yeah, regardless of whether that's right or wrong, like really high quality controlled research on steroids isn't completely non-existent, but there's not much of it.
Yeah, where I'm falling back into it is the crack I used to make back was show me the program that was written for people just on steroids, or show me the program and then show me the difference, because one or the other. Like you would assume the person on steroids can train more frequently, so there'd be more workouts. Yeah. But yet there's not, right? So it's basic. The point that I'm trying to get at is I think it's a non-issue if the skill level is the same and they both have, say, the same experience. Yeah. They're both going to have, I believe, right, have to have built their abilities to the same point that will one recover faster than the other. I think that there's a lot of natural people that if they're in a lot better shape and they're better aerobic shape and they're better conditioned, they're better trained, are probably recovering better than the anabolic athlete who's eating like shit, that's not sleeping very well. Yeah. It can make up some ground, but not all.
I mean, I suspect you're correct. Yeah. Like I'm just not in a position to answer that as any sort of expert source.
Well, I'm going to spin that into the research on supplements, because we're in an industry that's very supported by pre-workouts, post-workout, intra-workouts. And I've seen what I've seen on it, and it, as far as research coming out and all that, and it's very insignificant, on what the return is on small numbers, right? So how do I want to go about asking this one? Because I mean, it's you know where I'm going. I'm
not embedded with any supplement companies.
Right,
I can talk freely here.
Okay. So you know where I'm talking about. I mean, you have quoted research, which is bullshit. And then when you go look at it, then all these lifters and athletes are jumping on all this different kind of stuff, spending a shit ton of money, and for what may at best. And this is the best. I mean, you'll know better than I do. I mean, what are we talking about? Difference, like less than 0.5%? If
I mean, over the course of a training career, probably. Yeah, I mean, Yeah, so it depends how you quantify things, because you could say look at a study on creatine, and maybe the creatine group puts 15 pounds on their bench and the non-creatine group puts 10 pounds on their bench, and you say, oh, well, creatine increases your strength gains by 50%, because 15 is 50% more than 10. I don't know. I don't think that's going to generalize over the next 5 years of training. Like, I don't think by the time one person puts 200 pounds on their bench, the other person would have put 300 pounds on their bench. So yeah, over the course of a training career, it's hard to say how much of a difference it makes. But yeah, and another important thing to keep in mind is, like, it's important to look at the time course of, basically, is it an acute or chronic study? Because for chronic adaptations, like, will this actually help me get stronger and build more muscle? We know creatine works really well. And if someone's not getting enough protein from their diet, protein supplements work pretty well. Beyond that, I mean, there's a ton of stuff that we know helps acute performance a little bit. Maybe it'll help you lift 5 more pounds in the gym. Maybe it'll help you get an extra rep or two on a set to failure. Like, caffeine would definitely be in that category. Citrulline malate, or just citrulline potentially. Maybe beta alanine, although that one's getting iffier by the day. Potentially like nitrates, like beetroot juice. So, like, there are a few things that kind of fall into that category. But then the question is, like, hey, if you're getting an extra rep in the gym, will that actually help you build more muscle over time? We'd like to think it would. And that's the basic pitch that supplement companies make. Like, this will improve your performance acutely, therefore it will improve outcomes long term. But in a lot of cases, we just don't know that. And in the case of caffeine, this is actually crazy. There have been like literally hundreds of studies looking at the impact of caffeine on acute performance. And we got our first study looking at the longitudinal effects of caffeine supplementation before training on actual strength gains over time, like last year. Didn't do anything. So, like, yeah, my list of supplements that I would recommend without reservation is creatine and nothing else.
Yeah.
And yeah, like, I don't want to make it sound like supplements don't do anything. And for the stuff that might improve strength endurance a little bit, if you're going to a strongman show or if you're going to a CrossFit competition or something, and you're like, hey, acutely, I need to do everything in my power to maximize performance on this day. Yeah, sure. Like, it's probably going to do something for you. And some of the supplements without longitudinal research, it very well may improve strength gains or hypertrophy over time, but in a lot of cases, we just don't know. Mm-hmm. And in a lot of cases, when we do study that stuff over time, it seems to not do much.
Well, there's the other variable, which would be if the person thinks, that there's another one, right? So if the person thinks it's going to help them,
yeah,
then there's placebo. Will help them, right?
Have you looked into the placebo steroid research?
Mm-mm.
So this is fascinating. There are only 2 studies, but they're 2 of my favorite studies that have ever been published. So there was a study by Ariel and colleagues back in 1974, I believe. And what they did in this study is they had a group of people train for 7 weeks, and they told them, like, hey, and this is in the era where steroids are legal. Mm-hmm. They told these people, like, hey, if you train really hard, like the people who make the largest strength gains over the first 7 weeks, we're going to give you gear, and then we're going to see what that does for you. And so for the first 7 weeks of training, they did have like a real incentive to try to train hard. Like they were going to get free gear out of it, which is pretty cool. Yeah. And then for the last 4 weeks, they took they didn't take the half that made the best strength progress. They just randomly selected half of their sample, gave them, I believe it was saccharin tablets that they said was like D-ball or something, and just had them keep going with the same training program for another 4 weeks. And they tested squat. They tested basically just pressing stuff. They tested squat, bench press, standing overhead press, and seated overhead press, if memory serves. And for the first 7 weeks, that group of subjects put an average of, if memory serves, 10 kilos on those lifts, so like 22 pounds. Over the last 4 weeks, they put an average of like 45 kilos on those same lifts. So they were making strength gains at like 7.5 times their previous rate, just because they thought they were using gear. And, I'm sure that doesn't extrapolate to infinity and beyond.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's a notable difference.
No, that's huge.
And then in 2001, this I think is my favorite study that's ever been conducted, just because there's deep, rich personal layers to this one. So in 2001, there was a study by Maganaris and colleagues, and I don't think it was him. I think it was his co-author, was the coach for the British USAPL single ply powerlifting team. And USAPL is drug tested, but also kind of in the prior era of the USAPL, where like you could kind of get away with some stuff. So they go to their coach. They trust their coach enough that they go to him and say, "Coach, Great Britain, it's not a powerlifting powerhouse. I think we need a bit of chemical assistance to compete. So like, we trust you enough. Can you get us steroids?" Their coach was also a scientist. And so instead of getting them steroids, he says, "Ooh, this is an interesting time to study the placebo effect." So he gets up with his collaborator, Maganaris, and what they did is they tested all of the lifters squat, bench, deadlift pre, and like these were pretty strong guys.
These are competitive lifters.
Yeah. Like the average squat and deadlift was like low to mid 6s. Average bench was like mid to high 4s, if memory serves. So like pretty strong guys. And so then, they test them. 2 weeks later, they come in and they say, "Hey, we got some stuff for you. Give them placebo pills, not steroids, just placebos." And apparently these guys were trying to get their hands on gear in 2001. Like the internet existed. They could have looked to see, how do steroids work? But apparently they thought that steroids just acutely made you much stronger. So they give them these placebo steroids and test squat, bench, deadlift again. And the average increase was like 4 or 5%. So, we're talking about people who already squat 600 pounds, putting 30, 40 pounds on their squat, 20, 30 pounds on their bench, just because they're given these placebo pills that they think are steroids, which like, even if they were, they wouldn't improve performance that much acutely.
Like that. No, that's a lot.
Yeah. And so then another 2 weeks go by.
Wait, that was in 2 weeks?
Yeah. So here's the timeline. They test performance without any placebos. Then 2 weeks later, they give them the pills and test performance on the same day.
On the same day?
On the same day. Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So they test performance on the same day. And then they kept giving them these placebo pills while they trained for another 2 weeks. Okay. And then at the end, they told half of the lifters, "Guess what? You've been taking placebos the whole time." They told the other half of the lifters, "Guess what? It's still steroids. You're still on gear. Very cool." But before they told them that, they asked them just like, "Hey, how's your training been going?" And all of them were just like, "Dude, best 2 weeks of training of my life. It's great being on steroids. I'm hitting weights I've never hit before. My recovery's way better. I can handle way more volume. Being on steroids is sick. Thank you for getting me steroids, coach." And so then they tell half of them, "Psych, you've been on placebos." The other half still thinks they're on steroids. Test squat, bench, deadlift maxes again. The half that have now been told that they were on placebos the whole time just fully regressed back to their original numbers. So at this point, they already know those PRs that they hit 2 weeks prior, they weren't on steroids for those. Like they've been clued into that, but they just fully regressed to their original numbers. The half that still thought they were on steroids didn't make like another 4 or 5% jump, but they on average still increased strength. Like their lifts went up like another 5 kilos or whatever. And again, I'm sure that you can't just extrapolate that in forever.
Yeah.
But it does illustrate the magnitude of potential placebo and expectancy effects. And so, when it comes to supplements, there's a part of me that has wondered, what if I just lied to people? Because, if you could tell people this pre-workout you're taking, it's basically steroids. Would they get placebo and expectancy effects of that magnitude? And if they could, am I potentially doing them a disservice by saying, it probably doesn't really do much for you?
Or when you think a little bit on a broad scale, that's what's happening now.
I think it is. Yeah.
So you know what I'm saying? And so you wonder, it's how much of is it a disservice? Is it wrap your head around that one, right? Like, is it a disservice? Is it morally wrong? If they think it's working, it's.
I could never do that. If I was knowingly lying to people, I couldn't sleep at night. But, I do think that that's an ethical question where, like, if someone came down on the other side, I'd be like, I disagree with you, but I kind of see where you're coming from.
Yeah, it is. That's that's a lot, of that. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around that. Give me a minute, because that's a lot to be able to, with that study that you're talking about is insane. Especially the same day. Like how, especially, I can't wrap my head around that, because you're not talking.
And then the fact that they've regressed back to their original numbers.
I know that.
Yeah.
I haven't even got to that, wrapping my head around that one yet, totally. But the other one is these lifters should know. It's not like you just gave them adrenaline.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow. That's crazy. That's insane. Okay. Let me reel this back in here. How can people get a hold of you? Let's just wrap this up. So,
sure. So, strongerbyscience.com is probably the best place. If you want to message me, either shoot me an email or hit me up on Facebook. Email's nuckols.greg@gmail.com. I check my Facebook inbox with some regularity. If you hit me up on Instagram, that's a black hole. I responded to you because you're Dave Tate, but I've got like 200 unread Instagram DMs. So yeah, website for content. And then if you want to get in touch with me, probably Facebook and email.
Okay. I put that in there now because I always forget to do that at the end. So that way I cover my ass if I forget, and we know how to be able to put it in there. With the research side, where do you see this? Because one of the questions, and you kind of touched on it before we started this podcast, is somebody asked, like, where do you see the future of this going? With it becoming more and more and more and more. So what do you think is going to happen with the exercise? How do we wrap our head? Exercise science, nutrition, sports science, right? Where do you see this moving in the future?
I'll tell you where I see it moving and where I hope it moves, and they're two different places. So we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, and one of the drawbacks to scientific production, at least how it works in our field, is that for the most part, the actual like academics, like the assistant professors, associate professors, full professors, most of them are just so busy with all of the stuff they're doing. They're mentoring students, they're teaching classes, they're sitting on committees, they're going to conferences, et cetera, that like I don't think I'm sharing any secrets right now. This is something that they tell me almost unanimously, is that they don't have nearly as much time to keep up with the research as they would like to. And that's becoming a bigger and bigger problem over time, because the amount of research that's getting published in our field is increasing at an exponential rate. And I don't mean that as a figure of speech. I mean literally at an exponential rate. If there were 100 papers that would get published on a particular topic 10 years ago, there's 1,000 today. And so if you're already having trouble keeping up with it, it's going to be harder and harder to just know where the field is, and therefore know what questions to ask and what studies to do to push things further. And so I think that's going to be a structural problem. And then another problem, not really a problem, but a pretty good chunk of the research in our field is initiated by graduate students. And so, people doing master's theses, doctoral dissertations, who, know as much about the research as someone could be expected to know at 23 years old or 26 years old or whatever. But, probably not enough time to really dig into everything to know like what a really, really interesting and novel research question to ask is. more so with the masters than the doctoral people. Like people doing their doctoral dissertation are tend to be pretty fucking bright and know their area of research inside and out. But yeah, so as more and more research is published, if you're trying to get all the way caught up with the research in a particular area in a year to propose a master's thesis, good luck. Like that's already hard, and it's only going to get harder. So I think that the volume of research published is going to keep increasing, but I think that the amount of like novelty and new insight on average from each paper is going to tend to trend down, just because it's becoming harder and harder to know like what that next question is. So I think that's unfortunate. And I also think that like the research paradigm we currently use, like generally parallel groups designs, I think that's probably going to stay the dominant paradigm, at least for the foreseeable future. Where I would like it to go is a lot more of the sorts of studies that I mentioned previously. So either like crossover design studies, like longitudinal crossover design studies, and there's a reason not many of those happen. It's because like if you're putting the same group of people through two different interventions plus a washout period, instead of running a study over 16 weeks, now it might take 40. And so, that's inherently more challenging. Or within subject unilateral designs, then with exploratory stuff to try to figure out predictors of what particular interventions work particularly well for particular types of people. Like, I think that that's going to be the more insightful research moving forward, because I don't know, I could be completely ass backwards and wrong about this, but I do think most of the big rocks have been turned over already in terms of just the basic training variables you need to build muscle, get stronger. And so now I think where we need to go is moving beyond that and trying to figure out how to optimize training for the individual. And like there are research methods you can use to get at that, but they're at the moment pretty uncommon. So I would like to see more of the sorts of studies that can go down that road.
How do you guys figure out what you're going to review?
I
mean, it's like I said, it's a broad. Do you go off what's trending, or do you go off what people are asking?
Sometimes we go off what's trending. So we Mass is published with basically a month of lag time. So like if a study gets published in late June, as soon as it hits the presses, some people might start talking about it, but then that would be in our July journal sweep, and we might be writing about it for the issue that comes out August 1st. And so if we see a particular study getting a lot of chatter, especially if we think that the chatter is wrong in some way, we might say like, okay, we're going to pick this one out. Like we're going to do this one. But for the most part, we have two guys who look through the research for us. I used to do this. It took for fucking ever. So I'm glad we hired out. But Colby Souza and Kedrick Kwan, shout outs to them. They're awesome. We have a list of like 145 journals we go through every month, plus just like a generalized PubMed search to pull in other papers that maybe were published in journals that don't tend to publish that much exercise stuff. And they just go through that on approximately the 20th of every month, put all of the titles and links in a spreadsheet, and they'll generally pull in between like 250 and 400. And then the four of us that write Mass just go through. And the first step is just skimming the titles, to see what generally looks interesting. And from that, we'll generally whittle it down from about 300 studies to about 50. And then for those 50, we'll, skim the abstract to see, like, was the title misleading us or not? That'll generally kick out about another 10. And then for the last 30 or 40, you actually get the full text, read the full text, and see, like, is this worth reviewing or not? So that's the general process.
All right. With autoregulation, right? It's when let me define how I define that, because it can be misinterpreted as DUP or all there's all this where what what I told you a little earlier, I think during the break, is what I try to help lifters with is to learn how to auto-regulate every aspect, you know, of their training. So yes, there's going to be certain attributes to develop during blocks or 3-week periods, but inside of that, you know, when they walk in the gym, they should base their warm-up based upon how they feel. You know, maybe do some arm swings, move around tight, do more. Warm-ups the same way. You know, how's the bar feel? If it doesn't feel good, do it again. If it doesn't feel good, do it again. If it doesn't, keep going. And basically, when you look at what they will do, and I think this is probably any more advanced strength athlete. If you look at here's what they have written down to do, then you look at what they actually do. There's some correspondence, but there's a big difference between the two.
Yeah.
Right. Just where I think some shortfalls with the online training community and programming and all that is the lifters see this is what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah.
And I'm only going to do this.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's a broken system. Right. But at the same time, I don't know the best way to go about explaining to people how broken that actually is.
Yeah.
Like where you can't pull a paper or research summary and say, here's why this is broken.
Yeah.
Right. So how would you explain that?
Well, I mean, I guess my first question / statement is broken for who? Because I mean,
yeah, good point.
It's broken for the lifters. I think that it's a very lucrative approach for people who want to have a roster of 100 clients that they barely know their names of.
Yeah.
So I kind of think that's the reason people do it.
But how do we help those that are on the receiving end to understand here's your program and hopefully it's structurally sound.
Yeah.
You know, hopefully that's a big assumption there too, but let's just assume that it's structurally sound. You know, how do we, you know, help them to understand here are things that you can kind of pivot around?
You know, that's a good question, because like if you assume that this person is already following you, like they've hired some other coach to do their programming, but they're following the information you put out, then it's a very straightforward answer to the question, which is, you know, create high quality educational resources to teach people these things. If they're not already kind of in your information sphere, then I legitimately don't know how you solve that problem. Like if they're just bouncing around from like shitty online coach to shitty online coach and are never going to stumble across you in the first place, like I don't know what to do.
Yeah. It's because there's two sides, right? So there's the person that's going to say, you know, that their coach is, you know, world champion coach or whatever. So meathead coach. So they're going to do what they say because of that. Then the other ones are going to say, well, I can't bend from this because this is a science-based program.
Oh, yeah.
So then you see them. So now they're locked into it because if they bend from that, then they think that they're no longer that science-based.
I gotcha.
You see what I'm saying?
I gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I think...
I mean, I kind of know the answer is, yeah, everybody should educate themselves on the basics of training. But I think that we've lost that with a lot of people to where this, you know, online thing is here's this, even with Gen Pop, you know, it's here's this, do this. Okay, this is what I'm going to do. You're the guy.
Yeah.
You know, you're the girl. You're my coach. I'm going to do what my coach says. And then they don't take any time, you know, to educate themselves just on those basics to be able to know. You see where I'm going here?
Yeah.
So it's that disruption or gap or whatever it is, you know, it's, and I don't know if you know the answer because, you know, most don't, you know, because the answer is obviously more education.
Yeah.
But, you know, how do you tell people they need more education if they think I'm paying for this service and the service, this person's supposed to be doing that for me. But even if it's the greatest coach in the world, it's still not in sight.
You know, I wonder if you and I just have a different perspective on this because like powerlifting is, if not our entire lives, at least like a big part of our lives.
Yeah.
And so if the question is like, hey, there's something that I should know better, am I going to invest the time to read about this, learn it? The answer is going to be, yeah, absolutely. Of course we would. This is very important to us. I think that we might be kind of entering an era as powerlifting gets more and more popular that we're just seeing more and more just like strict hobbyists get into the sport. Like when powerlifting was still like a very underground subculture type thing, it was almost necessarily going to be a pretty big part of your lifestyle because it sort of had to be if you were going to find that community in the first place. And so you could expect a higher level of investment and a higher willingness of the average lifter to invest like time and effort into reading educational resources. But, so I am terrible at golf, but the thought has crossed my mind. Man, I've got friends who play golf. We do a lot of stuff together. They've invited me to go golfing, and I always tell them like, no, like you guys are good. I would fuck up your day on the links. I'm so bad. And so like the thought has gone through my mind like, maybe I should take some golf lessons so I can get decent at golf and play golf with my boys. If I went down that road, I can tell you, I'm not going to be investing 4 hours a day reading about how to get the best golf swing. I'm just going to hire a coach and he's going to teach me how to swing the club. I'm going to say, thanks, coach. And like, I don't know, as long as I can get the ball in the fairway 40% of the time, I'll say, yeah, good coach. It worked. And so I think that something like that is happening. Like the average level of investment of the typical lifter, I think is just lower than it used to be. And I think we see that as a problem because, if they were more invested, they probably would be getting better results. But I think they are kind of getting the results that comport with the level of investment they have. And there's a part of me that thinks that like that's just a necessary consequence of the sport getting more popular.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Yeah, I've not framed it in that context, but thinking of it in that context makes sense. Where, if I guess if they're ready, they're going to find if they want to move up, in that ladder, they will invest more.
Yeah.
To what, like if I was to golf, I'm not going to. The same thing is like as soon as you said that, I thought to myself, "Oh no, I ain't. Yeah, no, I'm not going to go and learn all about this stuff. I'm just going to go hit the damn ball." So that makes sense there. Are there other things that when I don't know how much time you have because you do a lot of stuff when you're just going through random content, YouTube or whatever it's going to be. What are some of the trends that you're seeing now that you just kind of like roll your eyes, and say, the fuck?
Man, so this isn't a training trend, but the thing that is, the thing that gives me headaches more than anything is like carnivore shit. Like, dude, so if someone wants to eat meat, that's totally fine. Like I'm an omnivore, whatever. But then the people who are saying don't eat vegetables because they'll kill you, insane. Like where is that coming from? So yeah, that is the most confusing one to me, hands down. Let's see. I don't know. I feel like we're in a fairly non-insane era when it comes to training stuff.
I do think this training stuff has kind of like...
Yeah. If you would have asked me 5 years ago, I would have had a long list. But yeah, I don't know. I'll occasionally see like a video on Instagram of someone doing like a dumb exercise. I'm like, yeah, that's dumb, whatever. But I don't really see like any really stupid mass movements these days, which is good, I think.
It is interesting, isn't it? Because you could normally predict what would come next, right? Because you would see, usually I would say it's like a high volume. So you see this big high volume push through the hypertrophy community. Yeah. And then you're like, okay, we're about 2 years away from this low volume, high intensity. Yeah. And it just keep rotating through where...
Yeah. Someone is going to write a popular article about the Colorado experiment where the guy like put on 40 pounds of muscle again after the car accident with with low volume, high intensity training. And people are going to discover that for the first time, and everyone's going to cut their volume by 90%. And yeah,
I keep waiting, but like you said, it's been a while. So I wonder if we crossed that chasm per se, and with more content, I think more content's always a good thing, right? So yes, there's a ton, but usually with more content, a lot of those things, the increased education across the spectrum, always subdues, until we start talking about the things like you just talked about, the nutrition side, where there's a ton, of information, but shit still pops up. But
well, and one thing I'll say is I think a lot of old school guys very understandably are frustrated by the current push into like science and everything. Where it's like, look, back in the day, we just went and lifted weights. We learned from the biggest guys and the successful coaches, and like, why you got to bring all of this science into it? And like, I kind of understand that frustration, but I do think when there's a lot of value on research, it does. I think it's a force that makes everything more boring, but also less insane. Like you can find your way to some really bonkers ideas if you're just swimming in the realm of anecdotes. But I think that when people are paying more attention to the research, it's hard to come up with training ideas that are that stupid if you're trying to put citations on everything.
yeah, I mean, at this point, because with those guys you're talking about, I don't really see a whole lot of them left, anymore. And for the ones that have been around long enough, I mean, they've been around long enough to realize that, 90% of the shit is science-based that most of them are doing. It's the 10%. There's always going to be 10% stupid shit. I mean, it's just, and maybe there is scientific evidence to justify why there should be 10% stupid shit, because something's got to be done outside of the realm, to be able to test what the hell is going to get studied next.
I kind of view it in kind of the same way as like evolution works, where if there's not enough random mutations taking place, then a particular like species just gets stagnant. And so if the environment changes, they're more likely to get like wiped out or whatever. But then if there's, if there's too many just random mutations that are happening, then like stuff's more likely to get fucked up and just go and just find its way to like a terminal point where it can't keep adapting and improving. And so I think you kind of need that with training as well. Like I think that if there's no kind of like shared reality in the training space where most people kind of agree on a lot of stuff, then you're just in the realm of anecdotes where someone says one thing, someone says another thing. They're not really in conversation with each other very much. And there's no real capacity to truly make progress, because you can't really say like we know anything. Like people are saying all sorts of stuff, but there's nothing we can all kind of agree to and say like, okay, this is known and we can build from that. But then if things get too stagnant and no one's willing to ever take a swing and throw a wild idea out there, then things just get too stagnant and there's also not much room to make progress. Yeah. So I think you need both.
You do, and it's still the strength industry, right? So if most are going to agree on 80, 90, probably 90%. The basic principles are the basic principles. Even the people that that disagreed with all that but have been around 30 years, they agree with it now. Yeah. Because they've seen all the things that don't work to be able to know what does and what doesn't work, and have paid the price for that. But that on that 10%, because of the industry we're in, there's a lot of positioning, that happens, and marketing, whatever you want to call it. So they're going to come up with their nuance, to be able to have their voice or whatever it's going to be that gets up there. And usually, not always, but less now than before. Usually when you dig underneath that little layer that they're putting out there, like, oh, all the other stuff makes sense. Yeah. This is just that because this is where the attention's being garnered. Yeah. And that, unfortunately, but it's less now. Now that I keep thinking, usually that's where you'll see the debates. You know, like this person's going to go after this person, and they're just going to go back and forth about this stupid shit that really isn't 90% of what either one of them do.
Yeah.
But it provides that traction and traffic.
Dude, my favorite example of that, I've seen 5 rounds of this occur. People just going at each other's throats about whether squats or deadlifts or squats or hip thrusts are a better glute training exercise. And then when they actually get on a call and talk about it, they're like, yeah, well, I mean, we both have our clients do both squats and hip thrusts, but like, which one is more effective? It's like, you're doing both of them already, so why does it matter? But yeah, so yeah, sometimes there will be like little petty shit like that, but whatever.
Now, how much of that petty stuff stems out of, as you said before, you'll see a research article that pops. If that research article pops, then is that somebody will jump on that and then run with that, and then that ends up being something that you guys are going to end up covering?
I think there's some of that. I think a lot of it is just cultural and aesthetic, where, you know, someone who's like more hardcore finds someone who's like more reserved and sciencey, and it's like, I just don't like the cut of your jib, and I'm going to try to find something I disagree with, and we're going to fight about it. Or it goes the other way. I think a lot of people who are kind of more in the sciencey side of things just need to meet more meatheads and realize that like they're not stupid. Like if you've been training for a long time, you've learned some things. You know what you're talking about for the most part. But yeah, they might look and just be like, oh, these people look different than me. They sound different than me. I'm sure they're stupid and wrong about a lot of stuff. So I'm just going to try to find something and start beef. And so I think there's a decent amount of that. I think that's a lot of what it comes down to these days.
Well, I think it works the other way too, where more of the meatheads need to get around, you know, people that are on the sciencey side of this thing to see where they're coming from.
Yeah.
You know, instead of just this default answer of, well, this study doesn't work with people who are like me. Well, dude, there's only like 0.5% of the people that are even like you to begin with.
Yeah.
You know, so there's that, like, and then a lot of the things that are dealing with just structural muscle and stuff like that, does that even make any difference?
Yeah.
You know, if it is, I don't think they understand that, you know, so they just assume this sample size was this.
Yeah.
And then because it's not them, there's nothing to be garnered from that study.
I think that's true.
I know it's true.
I mean, I also think a lot of people don't understand. Like, I think that there's a stereotype in people's head that like researchers don't know anything about lifting weights.
Yes.
Like they're just in the lab all day. They're not even that into lifting, and they don't know what people are talking about in the trenches. And that is true sometimes, but typically it's not. I mean, if you want to make it your career to study how to build muscle, you probably care about building muscle. You know what I mean?
Like, I get it.
That's insane to me. You know what I mean? Like, I don't play an instrument, and like I'm not going to invest my life trying to progress music theory. You know what I mean? Yeah, if you're investing your whole life into studying something, you probably do care about it on an applied level to some extent. Yeah.
Okay. That's all I got, man. I appreciate you coming out. Love doing this.
Thanks for having me on.
It was a good
pleasure.
time. It was a good time. Thank you. And we are done.
Anything between 4-week-long mesocycle and an 8-week-long mesocycle, and that includes 1 week baked into each at the end for deloading, seems to be generally a good idea for muscle growth.
Nutrition is probably more important for the hypertrophy if I'm looking at the strength athlete, because if they go through that phase that they're supposed to go through that they don't go through, but then when they do go through, they don't go through it effectively,